Welcome to Haunted Voice Channel. Before we get started, just a quick reminder, there are minimal ads in this video. If you enjoy the content, please hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps me create more stories for you. Also, I'd love to know where you're from and what time you're watching. I hope you enjoy the stories, and thank you so much for tuning in. Now, let's get started. It started as a normal shift, or as normal as it gets when you're a park ranger stationed deep in the heart of Blackthorn National Forest. I had been at this post for years, too many years really, long enough to get used to the isolation and strangeness of the place. People called this forest cursed, but I chalked it up to the usual ghost stories campers like to tell around the fire. Still, I couldn't deny that Blackthorn had an unsettling atmosphere, especially when night fell, and the trees seemed to close in like shadowy sentinels. I was stationed at Fairwatch Tower 8, the most remote outpost in the entire park, a lonely structure perched on a hill, surrounded by dense pine forest and thick underbrush. It was nearly a mile to the nearest road, and the last time I had seen another person was 2 days ago. I didn't mind. The solitude was something I had grown to appreciate, but that night something was different. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, like the trees were holding their breath, waiting. My shift began like any other. I grabbed my radio and did the usual check-ins with the other towers, but there was no reply. I wasn't surprised. Communication often went down in these parts. Still, something nagged at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching, something old and hungry. Around midnight, I decided to take a walk. The air was unnaturally cold for late summer, and a mist had started to roll in, creeping through the trees like fingers of smoke. My flashlight cut through the fog, but it wasn't much help. Everything beyond its narrow beam felt wrong, like the forest had shifted somehow, become unfamiliar. I kept to the main trail at first, but a faint sound caught my attention. Whispering. At least, it sounded like whispering. My heart thudded in my chest as I turned my flashlight toward the sound, sweeping the light over the trees. I saw nothing, but the whispering persisted, growing louder, more insistent. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding too loud, too intrusive in the stillness. No answer. The only response was the rustling of leaves, but the air was still, no wind. I should have gone back to the tower. Every instinct told me to turn around and lock myself inside, but I didn't. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that it was probably some campers messing around, maybe a lost hiker. I pressed on. The deeper I went, the stranger things became. The forest grew unnervingly quiet. No chirping of crickets, no rustling animals, just silence. And then I smelled it. A foul, acrid stench, like rotting meat left out in the sun. It was so strong I gagged, covering my mouth and nose. I swept my light around, desperate to find the source, and that's when I saw it. A figure barely visible through the fog, standing just off the trail. "Hey!" I called out, feeling a mixture of relief and fear. Maybe it was a lost hiker after all. But the figure didn't move. It just stood there, a dark silhouette against the mist. My light couldn't quite reach them, like the fog was swallowing the beam. I stepped closer, and that's when the whispering started again, louder this time, more urgent, and I realized it was coming from all around me. Dozens of voices, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. The figure took a step forward and my blood ran cold. It wasn't a person. The thing that stepped into my flashlight's beam was wrong. Its body was twisted, elongated, skin pale and stretched tight over bones that jutted out at impossible angles. Its face, or what should have been a face, was a mass of shifting features, like it couldn't decide what it was supposed to be. Eyes blinked in and out of existence, too many and then none at all, mouths that gaped and snarled and disappeared. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. I turned and ran, but the whispering followed me, growing louder and louder, like a chorus of voices pressing in on me from every direction. My flashlight flickered, then went out completely. I was running blind now, my breath coming in ragged gasps, the mist thickening, turning the forest into a maze of shadows and shapes. And then the forest shifted. One moment I was on the trail, and the next I wasn't. The trees around me were unfamiliar, twisted into unnatural shapes, their branches like skeletal hands reaching for me. I didn't know where I was anymore. Panic set in as I realized I couldn't find my way back. But the worst part was the noise, the soft padding of something following me, its footsteps impossibly light, yet constant. I dared a glance over my shoulder and saw it. A dog. At least it looked like a dog at first, but as it drew closer I realized it was too big, its eyes glowing an unnatural red in the darkness, teeth too long and too sharp. It moved in jerky, unnatural motions, as if it were trying to mimic a real animal, but didn't quite know how. I ran harder, crashing through the underbrush, branches slashing at my arms and face. The whispering grew louder, mingling with the thing's growls. I was losing ground, my legs burning, lungs screaming for air. Then I saw it, the fire watch tower barely visible through the trees. I was so close. I pushed myself harder, ignoring the burning in my muscles, ignoring the thing that was nearly on top of me. I burst into the clearing and sprinted for the tower, throwing myself up the steps 2 at a time. I slammed the door shut behind me, bolting it with shaking hands. For a moment I stood there, gasping for breath, listening. Nothing. Just silence. I let out a shaky laugh, relief flooding over me. Maybe it was gone, whatever it was. Maybe I was safe. I sank into the chair by the window, staring out into the fog-drenched forest. And then I heard it. A knock at the door, slow, deliberate. 3 knocks. My blood turned to ice. There was no one out there. I knew that. There couldn't be anyone out there. The knock came again. I stood up slowly, heart pounding in my ears, and crossed the room to the door. My hand trembled as I reached for the bolt. Something wasn't right. The whispering had stopped. The footsteps had stopped. But the knock came a 3rd time, louder, more insistent. I took a deep breath and opened the door. Standing there, in the doorway, was me. A perfect, distorted reflection. Same uniform, same face, except its eyes were all wrong. Hollow. Dark. It smiled, a grotesque imitation of my own smile, and then it whispered, "You've been replaced." Before I could react, it lunged and everything went black. When I woke up, I was in the woods, the mist swirling around me, the fire watch tower in the distance. But I couldn't move. My limbs felt heavy, like I was trapped in someone else's skin. And that's when I realized I wasn't me anymore. I was trapped inside, watching helplessly as it walked back toward the tower, toward my life. And no one would ever know. We were a group of 5 old college buddies who made it a tradition to go camping once a year. It was our way of staying connected despite our busy lives. This year someone suggested the Pine Barrens. I'd heard of it before. Who hadn't? The stories about the Jersey Devil, weird disappearances, strange lights in the sky. It seemed like the perfect spot for a weekend trip. A little adventure, a little spooky fun. It was late fall, so the nights were cold and the days were short. We arrived at the campsite just before dusk. The air smelled of damp leaves and pine needles, and a thick layer of fog hung low over the ground, swirling like a living thing between the trees. The forest was dense, the trees gnarled and towering, their branches twisted together in ways that blocked out most of the sky. Even in daylight it felt heavy, like the woods themselves were watching us. We set up camp quickly, a circle of tents around a crackling fire. We cooked, drank a few beers, and shared the usual stories. But as night deepened, the atmosphere shifted. The forest seemed to grow quieter, more oppressive. No owls hooting, no wind rustling the leaves. Just silence. It was Brad who first mentioned the strange feeling. He had been staring into the trees, his face half illuminated by the firelight. "You guys feel that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Feel what?" I asked, glancing up from my drink. I don't know. Like we're being watched." We all laughed it off, blaming the eerie reputation of the Barrens and a few too many beers. But deep down, I felt it too. There was something off about the place. The quiet was unnatural, and the way the fog curled through the trees made everything seem distorted, as though the woods weren't quite real. As the night wore on, our conversation dwindled, replaced by a sense of unease none of us wanted to acknowledge. By midnight, we had all retreated into our tents, the fire reduced to glowing embers. I lay there in the darkness, listening to the dead silence outside. My breath felt too loud, my heart beat too quick. Every crack of a branch, every shift in the wind, if there even was wind, set me on edge. I was finally drifting off to sleep when I heard it, a sound so faint I thought I had imagined it at first. A low, guttural whisper like something speaking just beyond the edge of the campsite. I held my breath, listening. There it was again. A voice, but not in any language I understood. It sounded garbled, like the words were coming from a throat not meant to speak. I thought maybe it was one of the guys messing around, trying to spook the rest of us, but it didn't sound like any of them. And then I heard footsteps, soft, almost imperceptible, like someone or something was circling our camp. My heart pounded in my chest. I wanted to sit up, to unzip the tent and call out, but something stopped me. Some primal instinct kept me frozen in place, like a deer sensing a predator nearby. The footsteps grew louder, closer. They stopped just outside my tent. I lay there, every muscle tensed, barely daring to breathe. Then I heard the zipper, slowly, excruciatingly slowly. The zipper of my tent was being pulled down from the outside. My blood turned to ice. I reached for the flashlight beside me, but my hand trembled too much to grip it properly. The zipper paused halfway, as if whatever was outside knew I was awake, knew I was listening. I clenched my teeth, trying to keep from panicking. I told myself it was Brad or one of the others just messing with me. But deep down I knew it wasn't. The presence outside didn't feel human. It felt wrong. Too quiet. Too deliberate. The zipper resumed and cold air rushed into the tent as the flap peeled open. My heart raced, and I snapped the flashlight on, pointing it toward the entrance. There was nothing there, just the empty night and the mist creeping in like smoke. I exhaled shakily, trying to convince myself it had been the wind, or maybe I had imagined the whole thing. But as I reached forward to zip the tent back up, I saw something on the ground. Footprints. Not boot prints like mine or the others. These were long and clawed, like some kind of animal, but too big for a wolf or a bear. And they were fresh, leading away from the tent into the fog. I scrambled out of the tent, flashlight beam trembling as I followed the tracks. They led into the woods, but after a few feet they stopped, as if whatever had made them had simply vanished into thin air. A snapping branch behind me made me whirl around, the light sweeping over the trees. I caught a glimpse of something, just for a split second, a figure standing at the edge of the campsite, half hidden in the shadows. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long, bony limbs and eyes that gleamed in the darkness. I backed up, tripping over my feet, trying to get back to the fire, back to the others. But when I turned around, the campsite was empty. All the tent gone. My mind raced. I couldn't have wandered that far from camp. I had only taken a few steps into the trees, but now the fire was out. The tents were gone, and the silence was absolute. Panic surged through me. I called out for my friends, but my voice seemed to be swallowed by the mist, muffled by the dense woods. There was no answer. Nothing but the soft rustling of leaves. I ran. I didn't know where I was going, but I had to get out of there, had to find the others. But the woods were disorienting, twisting around me in ways that didn't make sense. Every tree looked the same. Every path led me in circles. The footsteps started again behind me, echoing mine, but always just out of sight. Finally, I broke through the tree line and stumbled onto the dirt road that led to the main highway. I turned back, gasping for breath, but there was no sign of the camp, no sign of my friends, just the endless stretch of dark woods. When I reported it to the authorities the next morning, they found nothing. No tents, no campfire, no trace of the others. It was as if they had never been there at all. Weeks passed, and search parties combed the woods, but no one was ever found. People told me I must have gotten lost, that maybe they had packed up and left while I wandered off in a daze. But I know what I saw. I know that something in those woods took them. And whatever it was, it let me go. But only so I could remember. Camping has always been our thing, me, Jake, Sarah, and Chris. We've been doing it for years, ever since college. No phones, no distractions, just the four of us and the wilderness. But this trip was different. We'd heard about a place deep in the mountains, far off the usual trails, a spot that barely anyone knew about. Jake had found it through some forum, a hidden gem for serious campers. The name of the place was Raven's Hollow. None of us had ever heard of it, but that's what made it so exciting. Something new, something untouched. It took us hours to drive there, the roads winding and narrow, cutting through dense forests that seemed to go on forever. By the time we reached the trailhead, the sun was already setting behind the mountains, casting long shadows through the trees. The air felt cooler up there still, like the forest was holding its breath. We grabbed our gear and set off, following a barely visible trail through the underbrush. There were no signs, no markers, just a path worn by a few brave souls who had come before us. As the light faded, the forest seemed to close in around us. The trees grew taller, their branches thicker, blocking out the sky. After a few hours of hiking, we finally reached the campsite. It was a small clearing surrounded by towering pines, a perfect circle of space that looked almost too perfect. Like something had cut it out of the forest. I shrugged off the feeling, figuring it was just the isolation getting to me. We set up our tents, built a fire, and settled in for the night. The usual banter filled the air, jokes, stories from the old days, plans for the next day's hike. But as the fire crackled and the night grew darker, something shifted. The woods around us were silent, too silent, and no crickets, no wind, no rustling of leaves, just nothing. We all felt it, but no one wanted to say anything. We just sat there staring into the fire, trying to ignore the oppressive quiet. Then, somewhere in the distance, a sound broke the silence. It was faint, barely audible over the crackling fire, a low, mournful wail that carried through the trees. "What the hell was that?" Sarah asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Probably an animal," Jake said, though his voice wavered. "A wolf or something." But we all knew it wasn't a wolf. There was something wrong with that sound, something unnatural. It didn't belong to any animal I'd ever heard before. The firelight flickered as the wind picked up, and the wail came again, closer this time. I exchanged a glance with Chris, who was sitting across the fire, his face pale in the dim light. "Maybe we should check it out," he said, standing up and grabbing a flashlight. "Are you serious?" Sarah asked. "What if it's dangerous?" Chris shrugged, but there was a nervous edge to it. "We're in the middle of nowhere. It's probably nothing. Could be a hiker lost out here." Against our better judgment, we all grabbed our lights and followed Chris into the trees. The forest felt different now, darker, thicker, like it was closing in on us with every step. The wail echoed through the trees again, so close it made my heart race. We moved slowly, our flashlights cutting through the thick darkness, but the beams felt weak, swallowed up by the night. Then suddenly we saw it. A figure stood just beyond the reach of our lights, motionless, tall, thin, and wrong. The proportions were off, limbs too long, head slightly tilted as it watched us from the shadows. "What the hell?" Jake muttered, stepping back. I could barely breathe. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It looked human, but there was something about it, something twisted. "Hello?" Chris called out, his voice trembling. The figure didn't respond, it didn't move, it just stood there watching. "I don't think that's a person," Sarah whispered, her voice tight with fear. And then, without warning, the figure jerked forward, moving in a way that no human should move. Its body bent at unnatural angles, limbs snapping and twisting as it rushed toward us. We ran. I don't remember the sprint back to camp, I just remember the sheer panic, the feeling of something chasing us, breathing down our necks as we tore through the trees. We burst into the clearing, breathless, and collapsed by the fire. But when I looked around, I realized something was wrong. The fire. It was dying, flickering weakly, like it hadn't been tended to in hours. And our tents. They were gone. Completely gone. No trace of them. No gear. No bags. Nothing. "What the hell?" Jake gasped, spinning around in confusion. "We were just here," Sarah cried. "We didn't go that far." It didn't make sense. We'd only been gone for a few minutes, but it looked like we hadn't been here at all. Like the camp had been abandoned for days. And then the wailing started again. But this time, it was all around us, surrounding us. I shone my flashlight into the trees, and there they were, figures, dozens of them, tall, thin, twisted. Their faces were hidden in shadow, but I could feel their eyes on us, feel the hunger in their gaze. We backed toward the center of the clearing, our lights flickering as the figures slowly closed in, their movements jerky, unnatural. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. And then I saw it, something that made my blood run cold. One of the figures stepped into the firelight, and I recognized it. It was Chris, or at least, it looked like him. But his eyes were wrong, his face twisted into a grotesque smile that stretched too wide. He stepped closer, his body bending and snapping in ways that no human should be able to move. "Chris," I whispered, my voice barely audible. But it wasn't Chris, not anymore. The wail came again, louder, closer, and I knew. Whatever these things were, they weren't human, and whatever had taken Chris, it wanted the rest of us too. I don't know how we got out of there. I don't remember running. I don't remember finding the trail. All I remember is waking up in the car, Jake driving like a madman down the mountain road, Sarah sobbing quietly in the back seat. We never talked about what happened. We didn't tell anyone. How could we? Who would believe us? But sometimes late at night I hear it again, that low, mournful wail, and I know it's still out there, waiting. I'm writing this now because I don't know how much time I have left. The ranger said he'd return by morning, but the sun hasn't risen yet, and I can't stay awake much longer. I'm holed up in this old ranger station, the last shelter before the deep woods swallows you whole. But I need to tell someone what happened before it finds me. It started like a regular camping trip, me and my buddy Kyle, two city guys looking for a break from the noise. We'd planned this for months, a weekend in the untouched wilderness of Black Pine National Park. It was far from any main roads, the kind of place where you could disappear for a while. That's what we wanted. To feel small again, like the world wasn't closing in on us. We parked the truck at the trailhead, strapped on our packs, and began the hike to an old campsite Kyle found on some obscure hiker's forum. The ranger we met at the visitor center had given us an odd look when we mentioned where we were headed. "People don't go up there anymore," he said, scratching his beard. His name tag read Collins. He had that hardened look, like a man who'd seen too much of these woods. "They say things. Change up there." "What do you mean?" Kyle asked with a laugh, not taking him seriously. Collins hesitated. "Strange sounds, animals acting weird. I've been around here long enough to know the difference between a bear and something else. People report seeing things, shapes, shadows, sometimes more." I brushed it off as local legend, just another campfire story to scare the tourists. We were experienced hikers, prepared for a weekend in the woods. What did we have to worry about? By the time we made camp, the sun was beginning to set behind the treetops. The air was crisp, the forest alive with the hum of insects and the occasional rustle of unseen creatures. We set up our tents, built a small fire, and settled in for the night. The first sign something was off came around midnight, I'd stepped away from the fire to take a leak and had just zipped up my pants when I noticed it. Everything had gone silent. Not the natural quiet of a sleeping forest, but an unnatural, suffocating stillness. No wind, no bugs, no movement, just silence. I turned back toward the campfire and froze. Kyle was still sitting by the fire, but something was wrong. His posture was rigid, head cocked slightly to the side like he was listening for something. His back was to me, but I could tell something was off. "Kyle?" I called softly, not wanting to startle him. He didn't respond. He just sat there perfectly still, staring into the flames. I took a step closer, heart pounding. "Kyle, are you okay?" Suddenly, he moved. Slowly, deliberately, his head twisted further toward his shoulder, too far for it to be natural. My breath caught in my throat as he turned to face me. It wasn't Kyle. It looked like him, sure, but the eyes, those empty black eyes, told me it wasn't him. They gleamed in the firelight, too wide, too focused. The mouth twisted into a smile, but the skin around it stretched unnaturally, as though the face wasn't meant to hold that expression. A voice came from its mouth, but it was wrong. It was Kyle's voice, but hollow, as though someone were repeating words they didn't understand. "You shouldn't have come here," it said. I backed away, nearly tripping over a tree root. My mind raced. Where was Kyle? What was this thing? It stood up slowly, deliberately. I realized then that its movements were all wrong, too smooth, like a predator sizing up its prey. Panicking, I ran. I don't know how long I sprinted through the trees, branches whipping at my face, feet stumbling over rocks and roots. The moon was high, casting just enough light to see the faint outline of the trail. I didn't stop until I found the old ranger station, barely visible through the thick trees. The door was unlocked, and I threw myself inside, slamming it shut behind me. I looked out through the cracked window, panting, trying to listen for footsteps. But all I heard was that terrible silence. Hours passed, or maybe minutes, it's hard to tell. The ranger station was small, barely more than a single room with a few shelves and an old radio. I tried to use it, but there was nothing but static. My phone had no signal, of course. Then the knock came. At first it was soft, barely audible over my own breathing. A single, deliberate knock on the door. I froze, heart hammering in my chest. Another knock, louder this time. Then a voice. Kyle's voice. "Hey man, open up, it's me, let me in." It was him, Kyle, outside the door, but something was wrong with his tone. Too eager, too flat. I stayed silent, my hands gripping the edge of the table in the middle of the room. The knocking stopped for a moment, then the voice came again. "I'm cold, man, let me in, please." It was the same tone, the same repetition of words, like it was trying to remember how to ask, how to sound human. I backed away from the door. Then came the scratching, soft at first, then more insistent, like something dragging its nails down the wood. I could hear the thing breathing now, heavy, labored breaths as it scratched at the door. The voice came again, this time more forceful. "Let me in." I didn't respond. I couldn't. I knew, somehow I knew, that whatever was out there, it wasn't Kyle. The scratching stopped, and for a brief moment, everything was silent again. I dared to hope it had left. And then, from behind me, I heard the door to the back room creak open. I turned slowly, my breath catching in my throat. There, standing in the doorway, was Kyle, or what used to be Kyle. His skin was stretched tight over his bones, his eyes too large for his face, black and gleaming in the dim light. His mouth opened, and that same hollow, inhuman voice came out. "You shouldn't have come here." I ran. I don't even remember grabbing my pack, just the blind panic that gripped me as I bolted out of the station and back into the woods. The thing that looked like Kyle didn't chase me. It just stood there, watching, that twisted grin never leaving its face. I've been hiding in the woods ever since, moving from place to place, trying to stay ahead of whatever it is that stalks me. But I can feel it out there, always just beyond the trees, watching, waiting. The ranger, he never came back. But sometimes at night I hear his voice. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip, a weekend to disconnect, escape the grind, and breathe in the wilderness. Just me, my friend Ethan, and the untamed beauty of the dense Appalachian woods. We'd done this dozens of times, pitching our tent far off the beaten path, miles away from the nearest human being. It was what we lived for, until the night it all went wrong. We arrived late in the afternoon, sunlight dappling through the thick canopy of trees as we found the perfect spot. A clearing surrounded by towering pines, with a small creek running nearby. The air smelled of pine needles and damp earth, the sounds of nature all around us. Rustling leaves, chirping birds, the distant gurgle of water. Everything felt perfect, like nature welcoming us in. The first odd thing happened while we were setting up camp. Ethan had wandered off to gather firewood, and I was hammering down the last tent peg when I heard something. A low, guttural sound, like an animal growl, but distorted. It echoed from deeper in the woods, just far enough that I couldn't place what kind of animal it could be. I paused, listening, but when the sound didn't repeat, I chalked it up to my imagination. These woods were known for their wildlife, after all. Ethan returned, arms full of branches, and I asked him if he'd heard anything strange. He gave me a strange look and shook his head, dismissing it as forest noises. But even then there was something in his eyes. Maybe he had heard it but didn't want to admit it. The sun dipped lower, and we settled in around the fire, cooking our dinner and swapping stories as the sky bled into darkness. The woods were quiet now, unusually so. The normal chorus of crickets and frogs seemed absent, replaced by a thick, oppressive silence. The only sound was the crackling of our fire. I tried not to think too much about it, but my nerves were on edge. I could see it in Ethan, too, his usual laid-back demeanor replaced with unease. Every now and then we'd both glance into the shadows beyond the firelight, like we were expecting something to be out there. Around midnight, the temperature dropped sharply. The fire couldn't keep the cold at bay, and a thick fog began to roll in from the creek, swallowing the surrounding trees. It was then that we heard the footsteps, soft but deliberate, just beyond our campsite. Ethan shot me a look, and we both grabbed our flashlights, shining them into the trees. The beams of light cut through the fog, illuminating the underbrush, but there was nothing there. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. My heart pounded as we both strained to listen. The footsteps stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. "I think we should pack up and leave," Ethan whispered, his voice shaking. He wasn't the type to spook easily, but something had him rattled, and it was contagious. We stood, debating whether to take down the tent in the dark or just abandon it, when something moved at the edge of the clearing. Just a shadow at first, slipping between the trees. It was too quick to make out clearly, but it was big, and it wasn't moving like any animal I'd ever seen. The way it slinked from tree to tree, hunched over, almost humanoid, it sent a shiver down my spine. "Did you see that?" Ethan muttered, eyes wide. Before I could answer, the growl came again. This time it was unmistakable, low and guttural but wrong, like multiple voices layered over each other. It reverberated through the trees, coming from all directions at once. We grabbed our packs, abandoning the tent, and started for the trail. As we stumbled through the dark, I felt the undeniable sensation of being watched. No, stalked. Something was out there, pacing us, staying just out of sight but never far behind. We heard branches snap, leaves crunching underfoot, and every now and then that horrible growl. We broke into a full run. My breath came in ragged gasps as the fog thickened, making it hard to see. Ethan was just ahead of me, his flashlight flickering wildly. We were close to the trailhead, maybe a half-mile out, when Ethan stopped dead in his tracks. I slammed into him, almost knocking him over, and followed his gaze. There, in the middle of the trail, stood something. It was hunched over, its back arched unnaturally, with long, bony limbs that seemed too thin to support its body. Its eyes glowed faintly in the beam of Ethan's flashlight, yellow, like a predator's. And its face. It was like it was wearing a mask, a grotesque imitation of a human face, stretched tight over its skull but wrong in every way. Neither of us moved. We were frozen, paralyzed by the thing's gaze. It stood there, silent, watching us with an intelligence that felt far too human. Then slowly it tilted its head, and I heard a whisper, clear as day, but coming from all around us. Run. We didn't need to be told twice. Ethan bolted, and I followed, my legs burning as we sprinted down the trail. The thing didn't chase us, not directly, but I could feel it, feel them. More than one now, watching from the trees, their eyes glowing in the dark, their growls echoing through the forest. We reached the car fumbling with the keys as the air around us seemed to hum with static. As we peeled out of there, gravel spraying behind us, I glanced in the rearview mirror, and there it was, standing at the edge of the trees, watching us leave. Its head tilted again, that same twisted mockery of a human face, as if it was letting us go. We didn't stop driving until we were miles away, deep into the next town. Neither of us spoke, too shaken to even process what had just happened. It wasn't until the next morning, when we checked the footage from the trail cam Ethan had set up at camp, that we saw it. The camera had caught movement, around 2 a.m., just before we left. A figure, tall and lanky, standing at the edge of the clearing, watching us sleep. Its face was Ethan's, but Ethan was right next to me. We never went back to those woods, and we never talk about what we saw, not anymore. Some things are better left forgotten, but sometimes in the dead of night I still hear that growl, and I wonder if it's still out there, waiting. I always thought the woods were peaceful, even magical in a way. That was before I spent a night alone at High Pines, deep in the heart of Blackwater National Forest. It's a place that doesn't show up on most maps. Park rangers rarely mention it unless you're looking for something off the beaten path. I'm not sure what exactly drew me there. Some need to escape, to lose myself in the wild. It wasn't my first solo camping trip, but something felt off as soon as I crossed the threshold of those towering pines. The air seemed heavier, like the trees themselves were watching. Maybe it was just the isolation, the silence that stretched out for miles, broken only by the wind whispering through the branches. Or maybe it was the strange, uneasy feeling that had settled in my gut. I set up camp near a small clearing by dusk, close to the remnants of an old ranger station, now nothing more than a forgotten skeleton of logs and moss. The structure felt wrong, abandoned for reasons I couldn't quite put my finger on. The forest surrounding it seemed darker, thicker somehow, as though the trees were closing in. I convinced myself it was just the eeriness of being alone in such a remote place. I built a fire, hoping the light would chase away the creeping shadows. As the flames flickered and cast long dancing shapes around me, I began to notice something strange. There were no sounds, no birds, no insects, just nothing. The kind of silence that swallows everything whole. It was unnatural. My nerves were already on edge, but when I heard the first crack in the underbrush, it felt like a knife through my spine. Probably a deer, I muttered to myself, but my voice sounded hollow, almost absurd in the suffocating quiet. I stared into the woods, searching for movement, but saw only darkness, thick and impenetrable. Then I heard it again, closer this time, deliberate. Something was out there watching. I told myself it was just an animal. But then came the smell, rancid and overpowering, like rotting meat mixed with something else, something earthy and sickly sweet. I gagged, covering my nose, and stepped closer to the fire, my eyes darting between the trees. My mind raced, conjuring images of wolves, bears. But none of them explained the smell, or the sense of being hunted. I heard a low growl, almost too soft to catch, but there was no mistaking it. It wasn't human. and it wasn't like any animal I had ever heard. My heart pounded in my chest as the sound circled the camp, moving too fast, too deliberately. I grabbed my flashlight, pointing it into the woods, but the beam seemed weak against the oppressive darkness. For a moment, I thought I saw something. A tall, hunched figure, its eyes glowing faintly in the distance. But as soon as I focused on it, it was gone, swallowed by the trees. The growling stopped, replaced by another sound, something far more disturbing. Laughter. But it wasn't right. It was distorted, mimicking the sound of human laughter but with a jagged, inhuman edge. It echoed around the clearing as if the forest itself was mocking me. I grabbed my hunting knife, backing up until I was almost inside the old ranger station. The structure groaned under my weight, as though it resented my presence, but at least it felt like a barrier. The laughter continued, growing louder, more maniacal. Then it stopped, replaced by a voice, my voice. It called out to me, repeating my name slowly at first, then faster, more urgent. But there was no mistaking it. It was my own voice, calling from the woods. A cold chill swept through me. I stumbled back, knocking over a rusted lantern. My voice, how was that possible? I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe. I just stood there, frozen as something large moved just beyond the tree line. I didn't want to see it, but I had to. My flashlight flickered, catching something massive standing upright. Its eyes glowed an unnatural yellow, and its face. It was wrong. The features twisted, stretched, somewhere between human and animal. Its body was covered in matted fur, but its skin, where visible, was slick and pale as though it had never seen sunlight, and then it smiled. I swear it smiled. A wide, toothy grin that split its face unnaturally wide. The smell returned, stronger this time, and I gagged again. The creature began to move, but not towards me. Instead, it circled the clearing, faster and faster, making no sound except for the crunch of twigs beneath its heavy, clawed feet. I ducked into the ranger station, barricading myself behind the splintered door, hoping the flimsy structure would hold. I could hear it outside, pacing, laughing again, mocking me. And then it stopped, as though it had lost interest. I held my breath, straining to hear, but there was only silence once more. Hours passed. The fire outside had died to embers, and I finally dared to peek through a crack in the wall. The clearing was empty, save for the shadows of the trees. That's when I saw it, not the creature, but something worse. A figure in the distance, walking slowly through the trees. It looked human, almost, but its movements were jerky, unnatural. As it came closer, I recognized the clothes. It was a park ranger's uniform. I almost laughed with relief, thinking maybe help had come. But as it stepped into the moonlight, I realized my mistake. Its skin was ashen, its eyes hollow, and its mouth was stretched wide in that same horrifying grin. It raised one skeletal arm, beckoning me forward. And then I heard it, my voice coming from its throat. "Come here," it said. "You're safe now." But I wasn't. When I turned to run, I tripped over something on the floor. I scrambled to my feet, shining the flashlight on the object. It was a rotting park ranger's hat, covered in dried blood. Beneath it was a pile of bones, still dressed in the tattered remains of a uniform. That's when I understood. The thing in the clearing wasn't just mimicking voices, it was wearing faces. I never saw it again after I fled the woods that night. But I hear stories from time to time. Hikers who never return, strange laughter echoing through the trees. And sometimes, late at night, I hear my own voice calling from the woods. And I wonder if one day it will come back for me. I've been an avid camper for years, and there's not much I haven't experienced in the wilderness. Bears, storms, strange sounds in the night. None of it phases me anymore. But last summer, I encountered something that still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. Something that changed the way I see the woods forever. It started as a simple solo trip. I'd taken a few days off work, packed up my gear, and headed out to a part of the national forest I'd never explored before. It was about as remote as it gets, way off any marked trails, and that's exactly why I chose it. I wanted some peace and quiet, no distractions, just me and nature. The drive-in was long, and by the time I found a good spot to camp, the sun was already hanging low in the sky. I set up my tent in a small clearing by a river, the sound of the water creating a peaceful backdrop. It was the kind of place you dream about, untouched, serene, and completely isolated. Or so I thought. The first night was calm, nothing out of the ordinary. I sat by the fire, watched the stars, and let the silence of the woods sink in. There were no animal noises, which was odd, but not unheard of in more remote areas. I figured the wildlife was just keeping its distance. The next day I went exploring, hiking through the dense forest, following the river upstream. The forest was thick, the trees gnarled and ancient. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth and pine, and every so often I'd catch a glimpse of deer or other animals moving through the trees. But as I hiked deeper, the forest started to change. The first thing I noticed was the silence. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. No birds, no rustling leaves, not even the sound of the wind. It was as if the forest was holding its breath. And then there were the trees, tall and thin, their bark almost black, their branches twisted in unnatural angles, like skeletal hands reaching toward the sky. It wasn't long before I stumbled upon something strange. At first I thought it was just an old campsite, but as I got closer, I realized it wasn't that at all. In a small clearing, surrounded by those unnerving trees, stood a ring of stones. They were arranged in a perfect circle, each one about the size of a football, covered in moss and dirt. But what really caught my attention was what was inside the circle. There were symbols, crudely etched into the dirt, circles, triangles, lines that connected in strange, unnatural patterns. They didn't look like anything I'd ever seen before. It was almost like a ritual site, but who would come all the way out here to do something like that? I felt a chill run down my spine as I stood there, staring at the stones. The air around me seemed to thicken, the silence pressing down like a weight. I don't know how long I stood there, but eventually, the feeling of being watched became too overwhelming. I turned and headed back to camp, trying to shake the eerie feeling that had settled in my gut. That night things got worse. I was sitting by the fire again, trying to relax, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, just beyond the trees. The shadows seemed to move, shifting in the flickering light of the fire. And then, I heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping sound. It was subtle at first, almost like someone knocking on wood far off in the distance. But as I sat there, listening, the tapping grew louder, closer. It seemed to echo through the trees, coming from all directions. My eyes scanned the darkness, but I couldn't see anything. I told myself it was just a woodpecker or some other animal, but it didn't feel right. The sound was too steady, too deliberate. And then just as suddenly as it had started, the tapping stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. I sat there, gripping the handle of my camp knife, staring into the darkness, waiting for something, anything to happen. The fire crackled, the river flowed, but everything else was still. That's when I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, just at the edge of the firelight, I saw movement. I turned my head slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. There, standing at the tree line, was a figure. It was tall, unnaturally tall, its limbs long and thin, like the trees themselves. I couldn't make out any details, just a dark silhouette, standing impossibly still. I blinked, and for a moment, I thought it was just a trick of the light, maybe a tree casting a strange shadow. But then it moved. It took a step toward me, its movement slow and deliberate, almost graceful. The air around me seemed to thicken, the fire dimming as the figure approached. I couldn't move, couldn't think. I just sat there, frozen in place, my mind racing. And then, just as it reached the edge of the firelight, it stopped. For what felt like an eternity, we stared at each other, me, paralyzed with fear, and it, standing there, its dark, faceless form looming over the campsite. And then, without warning, it turned and disappeared into the trees, melting into the shadows as if it had never been there at all. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, knife in hand, my eyes darting between the trees, waiting for it to come back. But it never did. The next morning I packed up my gear and left as fast as I could. I didn't care about the rest of the trip, didn't care about exploring anymore. I just wanted to get out of those woods. As I hiked back toward my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every so often, I'd hear that faint tapping sound again, but every time I stopped to listen, it would disappear. By the time I reached the car, I was drenched in sweat, my heart racing. I threw my gear into the back seat and peeled out of there, not looking back once. I've been camping since then, but I've never gone back to that part of the forest. I don't know what I saw that night, but I do know one thing. Some places aren't meant to be found. Some places want to be left alone. And sometimes when you ignore that feeling in your gut, the forest sends something to remind you why. The drive up to the trailhead took longer than expected. My cell signal was already fading before I turned off the highway, and by the time I parked and killed the engine, I was completely cut off. No bars, nothing. The ranger station, a single squat building tucked into the forest, sat silent. There were no other cars in the lot except for an old Jeep, its tires coated in mud and the windows tinted a strange dark brown. I glanced at the sun hanging low in the sky. It was late afternoon, the perfect time to set up camp and settle in before dark. But I couldn't shake the strange stillness that had settled over everything the moment I'd stepped out of the car. The trees loomed tall and oppressive, their thick branches entwined overhead, casting deep shadows that made it seem like twilight had already begun. I'd come here to escape, to clear my head. A solo camping trip in the deep woods sounded like the perfect way to reset after months of stress at work. And this trail, tucked away in a remote section of national forest, was exactly the kind of isolation I craved. But now, standing alone in that empty parking lot, something felt off. There was no wind, no birds, not even the rustle of leaves. Just silence. I hoisted my pack onto my shoulders and headed for the trail, hoping the oppressive quiet would lift once I was deep into the woods. About 2 hours later, I reached the clearing where I planned to camp. A small, flat patch of earth nestled between two large, moss-covered boulders, with enough space for my tent and a small fire. The hike had been uneventful, though the sensation of being watched had gnawed at me the entire time. I kept hearing faint rustling in the underbrush, soft thuds behind me as if something was following, just out of sight. I brushed it off as deer or small animals, but there was a weight to it that I couldn't explain. It felt intentional, like something knew I was there and didn't want me to be. By the time I finished setting up camp, dusk had settled in. The temperature dropped quickly and I found myself standing near the fire, staring out into the thickening darkness. My flashlight beam barely cut through the dense trees surrounding the clearing, and every sound, every snap of a twig, seemed amplified. Then I heard it, a low growl so faint I thought I'd imagined it. My heart skipped a beat, and I scanned the tree line with the flashlight. Nothing, just trees, dark and still. I told myself it was probably a wolf or a coyote, but something about it was wrong. It didn't sound like an animal I'd ever heard before. It was deeper, more guttural. Hours passed and I sat by the fire trying to shake the unease that had settled into my bones. The growl hadn't returned, but every now and then I heard soft footsteps in the distance. At first, they were sporadic, faint, but as the night wore on, they grew louder, closer, circling the campsite. I gripped the hatchet I'd brought, heart pounding. My flashlight flickered and went out, plunging me into near-total darkness. The fire was my only light, its flickering flames casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to twist and writhe. Then, just beyond the glow of the fire, I saw it. At first it was just a shape, a hunched figure barely visible through the thick underbrush. It was tall, unnaturally so, with long, gangly limbs. Its head was misshapen, elongated, like a deer's skull, but with something wrong about it. The skin, pale and stretched tight over bone, gleamed in the firelight. It stood there, unmoving, watching me. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to run, but I couldn't. My legs refused to move. Suddenly, it shifted, moving with an unnatural, jerking gait. It stepped into the clearing, its eyes, black, empty holes, locked onto me. I stumbled back, tripping over a root, and landed hard on my back. The creature paused, head tilting in a grotesque mimicry of curiosity. And then it spoke. "Why are you here?" The voice was wrong. It sounded like a garbled mix of human and animal, as though it was trying to force the words through vocal cords that weren't made for speaking. I scrambled to my feet, backing away, but the thing just stood there unmoving, watching me with those empty sockets. Without thinking, I grabbed the hatchet and swung it at the thing, but it didn't flinch. My arms trembled, and before I could process what was happening, it turned and vanished into the woods, moving with an eerie, fluid grace. I didn't wait. I threw my gear into my pack, doused the fire, and started down the trail, flashlight clutched tight in my hand. And the further I went, the darker it became. The trail seemed to stretch on forever, twisting and turning in ways I didn't recognize. Trees closed in, their branches scraping against my face as I ran. I could hear them now, the footsteps, heavy and fast, following me through the underbrush. I was being hunted, and then I saw it again, standing in the middle of the trail, just ahead of me. The same creature, tall and grotesque, but this time it wasn't alone. Behind it, more figures emerged from the shadows. Some crawled on all fours, others stood tall, their shapes twisted and wrong, like animals that had been stretched and molded into human form. I turned to run in the opposite direction, but I froze. A park ranger stood there, illuminated by the faint beam of my flashlight. Relief flooded through me. I hadn't seen another human since arriving. "Thank God," I gasped. "I don't know what's happening, but we have to go." But the ranger didn't move. His face was blank, his eyes empty, hollow. And then he smiled. It wasn't a smile of reassurance, but something dark, predatory. "That's not how this ends," he said, his voice low and inhuman. As he stepped closer, his face began to change, stretching, contorting. His skin peeled away, revealing something beneath, something that shouldn't exist. The creatures surrounded me, and I realized with growing horror that they weren't hunting me. They were welcoming me. I looked down at my hands, long, skeletal, the skin stretched tight, and felt the hunger stir deep inside. I've always loved camping. Something about the solitude of the woods, the crackling fire, and the endless stretch of stars above has always called to me. I needed a break from the chaos of work, so when the opportunity came for a weekend in the Appalachian wilderness, I jumped at it. Just me, a tent, and the serenity of nature. The park was massive, a sprawling patch of untouched forest. The ranger at the station when I checked in gave me a friendly warning. "Just be mindful of your surroundings. These woods, they get confusing if you wander too far off the trail." He was an older guy, leathery skin from too many years in the sun, and a strange look in his eye as he handed me a map. "Anything specific I should be worried about?" I asked with a laugh, thinking he might mention bears or wolves. He stared at me for a second too long, then said, "Just stay close to the trail. The forest plays tricks." It was weird, but I brushed it off. Rangers like to keep the mystery alive. Adds to the charm, I thought. I found my campsite late in the afternoon, a small clearing deep in the woods, far from the main trails. Perfect. I pitched my tent, set up a fire pit, and relaxed, listening to the sounds of nature. Birds, the wind rustling through the trees, the distant rush of a stream. The forest was alive, yet peaceful. As the sun dipped lower, the atmosphere shifted. The forest, once vibrant, began to feel stifling. The wind died down. The birds went quiet. I convinced myself it was just the transition from day to night. Still, something felt off. It wasn't until I was sitting by the fire that I started to notice the sounds. At first, it was faint. Footsteps, maybe? Light, deliberate. I told myself it was an animal. A deer, probably. But then I heard it again. Closer this time. Slow. Calculated. I turned my flashlight toward the trees. Nothing. Just an endless stretch of towering pines and thick underbrush. But the feeling in my gut told me I wasn't alone. I shrugged it off and tried to settle back into the warmth of the fire. But then, right at the edge of the clearing, I saw movement, just a glimpse like a shadow flitting between the trees. My breath caught, and my heart raced. "Hello?" I called out, hoping it was just another camper. Silence. I scanned the tree line, but the figure was gone. My skin prickled, and I suddenly felt very exposed. I turned the flashlight back on, sweeping it across the darkness. Still nothing. Maybe it was the ranger checking up on me, I thought, but deep down I knew that wasn't it. Trying to calm myself, I decided to turn in early. The safety of my tent felt comforting, though I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something, or someone, was watching me. Sleep didn't come easily. Every creak, every rustle outside had me wide awake, clutching the flashlight. At one point I swore I heard whispering, low and unintelligible, drifting in the wind. My brain must have been playing tricks on me. I hadn't seen another soul out here since I arrived. Then came the scratching, soft at first, like something was brushing against the nylon of my tent. My breath hitched. I didn't move. I just listened. The sound circled the tent, moving slowly, deliberately, like it, whatever it was testing, probing. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the flashlight and unzipped the tent just a fraction, shining the light outside. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but the empty clearing. My heart pounded in my chest. But as I scanned the perimeter, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Just beyond the reach of the light, standing between two trees, was a figure. Tall, impossibly tall, its limbs too long and thin to be human. It was like a shadow. No, darker than a shadow. Its face. I couldn't see its face, just the outline, barely visible, but enough to fill me with a primal dread. I slammed the tent shut and scrambled for my phone. No service, of course. Panic set in. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I had just seen. It had to be a trick of the light. I was tired, scared, and my mind was playing tricks on me. Right? I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The scratching came and went, always just faint enough to make me question if I was imagining it. When dawn finally broke, I packed up as fast as I could. I needed to get out of there, back to the ranger station, back to civilization. But as I was folding up my tent, I noticed something that stopped me cold. There, in the dirt, were tracks, not animal tracks, not human either. They were large, clawed, and deeply pressed into the earth, like something heavy had been walking around my campsite all night. I snapped a picture, my hands shaking, before grabbing my gear and heading down the trail as fast as I could. Every crack of a twig, every rustle of leaves had me on edge. I just needed to make it back. The hike felt longer than I remembered, the trees closer, almost suffocating. But as I neared the ranger station, I finally started to relax. I was safe. It was over. But as I approached the station, I saw the ranger from yesterday standing outside, watching me. Relief washed over me, and I hurried toward him. "You weren't supposed to go that far in," he said before I could speak. His voice was cold, distant. "I stayed near the trail," I replied, confused. "I didn't get lost." He didn't say anything, just stared at me with that same unsettling look from the day before. That's when I noticed something was wrong. His skin, it looked off, like it didn't fit right. His eyes, too bright, too wide. And then I realized something horrifying. The ranger from yesterday was shorter, I stepped back, my heart pounding in my ears. This wasn't the same man. "Should have stayed on the trail," he said again, but his voice had changed. It was deeper, guttural, almost animalistic. I bolted for my car, not daring to look back. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away from that cursed forest. But even now, weeks later, I still can't shake the feeling that something followed me. Sometimes late at night, I hear scratching at my window. Camping had always been my escape. The serenity of the woods, the crackle of a fire, and the stillness of the night. It was my way of hitting pause on life. This trip was no different. I needed to get away, clear my head, and spend a few nights under the stars, far from the stresses of work and the noise of the city. I found a remote spot deep in the mountains, an area so secluded that not even hikers ventured out that far. Perfect. I packed light, just my tent, sleeping bag, a few essentials, and enough food to last a couple of days. No phone, no distractions, just me and the wilderness. The hike to my chosen spot took most of the day. The trail was rugged, but the air was cool, and the views were breathtaking. When I finally reached the clearing, it was just as I had hoped, completely untouched. Surrounded by towering pines with a small stream trickling nearby, the place felt like a hidden paradise. I set up my camp and built a fire as the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the trees. As night fell, the stars emerged, brighter than I had ever seen them. It was peaceful, perfect. I sat by the fire, watching the flames dance and listening to the quiet hum of the forest. It was everything I had come for. But then, as the fire began to die down and the night grew colder, I heard something faint, just beyond the reach of the firelight. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon scurrying through the underbrush. But the sound wasn't quite right. It wasn't rustling or the snapping of twigs. It was humming. A low, soft hum, like a voice but without any distinct words, drifting through the trees. I tensed, listening carefully, but the sound faded as quickly as it had come. I shook it off, telling myself it was nothing. The woods could be strange at night, especially when you're alone. My imagination was probably getting the better of me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The firelight flickered and cast long shadows around me, making the trees seem taller, more imposing. I added another log to the fire, hoping it would chase away the creeping sense of unease. But then the humming came again. This time it was closer. A soft, melodic hum, like someone humming a tune just out of earshot. I grabbed my flashlight and stood up, shining the beam into the trees. The light cut through the darkness, but all I saw were the trunks of the pines and the undergrowth. No movement, no glowing eyes reflecting back at me. I stood there, heart pounding, listening. The humming stopped. The only sound was the crackling of the fire and the distant trickle of the stream. I sat back down, trying to calm myself. It was probably just the wind, I told myself, or maybe some distant echo from the valley. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Hours passed and the fire burned lower. I couldn't relax. Every little sound, the snap of a twig, the rustling of leaves, sent a jolt of fear through me. I kept the flashlight close, my eyes darting to the edge of the clearing, where the darkness pressed in like a living thing. Then, just as I was starting to think I'd imagined it all, I saw something. A figure, barely visible in the shadows, standing just beyond the firelight. It was tall, too tall to be human, and its body seemed to shimmer in the flickering glow of the fire. It stood perfectly still, watching. I blinked, my breath catching in my throat, and the figure was gone. I shone my flashlight where it had been, but there was nothing, just trees and shadows. I told myself I was seeing things. The firelight, the shadows, the isolation, it was all playing tricks on me. But even as I tried to convince myself, I could feel it. Something was out there. I threw more wood on the fire, desperate to keep the light strong. The flames flared up, casting eerie shapes into the night. The temperature dropped even further, and the air felt thick, heavy, like the forest itself was closing in around me. And then I heard it again. Not the humming this time. No, this was different. Footsteps. slow, deliberate footsteps crunching through the underbrush, circling my camp. I stood up, my heart racing, shining the flashlight in every direction. But the beam revealed nothing. The footsteps continued, moving in a slow, steady circle around the clearing, just outside the firelight. I called out, my voice shaking, "Who's there?" No response, just the footsteps, always just out of reach. I backed up toward the fire, the flashlight trembling in my hand. I could feel eyes on me, cold, watching, waiting. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. The fire crackled softly, and I stood there, frozen, my pulse pounding in my ears. I could feel something out there, lurking just beyond the light, but I couldn't see it. And then from the darkness came the humming again. But this time it was right behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there, just the fire and the dark woods beyond. My skin crawled as the humming grew louder, echoing all around me, a haunting, wordless tune that sent chills down my spine. I grabbed my bag, heart racing, and made a decision. I needed to get out of there. I didn't care that it was the middle of the night. I didn't care how far I was from my car. I wasn't staying here another second. I stomped out the fire, packed up as quickly as I could, and started down the trail, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The forest was unnaturally quiet now, except for the humming, which seemed to follow me, growing fainter as I hurried down the path. But the feeling of being watched never left. I could feel it. Something was out there, moving in the shadows, keeping pace with me. I walked faster, then broke into a jog, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. I didn't stop until I reached my car, drenched in sweat and shaking. I threw my gear in the back, jumped into the driver's seat, and sped away without looking back. Even now, back in the safety of my home, I can't shake the feeling that I didn't leave that campsite alone, that whatever was out there, whatever was watching me, followed me back. Sometimes late at night, when everything is still and quiet, I hear it again. The humming, always faint, just outside my window, and I know whatever it is, it's waiting for me to come back. I always loved camping. The isolation, the quiet. Being completely disconnected from the world was something I craved. So when my buddy Mark suggested we head out to a remote spot in the Appalachians for the weekend, I jumped at the chance. It was the kind of place with no cell service, no people, just pure wilderness. We packed up the truck and set off early Friday morning. The drive was long, winding deeper and deeper into the mountains, until the road turned from asphalt to dirt. It felt like we were the only ones for miles. That kind of solitude was exactly what I wanted, or so I thought. We finally reached the trailhead late in the afternoon. It was eerie how quiet it was, not even birds. Just the crunch of our boots on the dry leaves and the whisper of the wind in the pines. We hiked a couple of miles into the woods until we found a spot to set up camp, an open clearing surrounded by towering trees that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. There was something almost suffocating about how thick the woods were, but we laughed it off. It's just nature, right? By the time we had our tents up, the sun was starting to set, casting long shadows through the trees. We built a fire, cracked open some beers, and sat back to relax. That's when the first strange thing happened. I was staring into the flames when I heard it, faint, almost like a whisper, but unmistakable. My name. Jake! I froze, my heart skipping a beat. I glanced at Mark, but he was busy poking at the fire, oblivious. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Hear what?" he replied, not looking up. I shook it off. The wind, I told myself, just the wind. But deep down, something about it didn't feel right. That night, the forest was unnervingly silent. No crickets, no owls, no rustling of leaves, just dead, oppressive stillness. Every snap of a twig or crackle from the fire made me jump. I lay in my tent, staring up at the dark canvas, unable to sleep. And then, sometime in the early hours, I heard it again. "Jake." This time it was clearer, closer. It was as if someone was standing right outside my tent, whispering my name. I shot up, heart pounding in my chest. Mark's tent was just a few feet away, and I strained to hear him breathing, but all I could hear was the soft, steady rhythm of my own breath and the blood rushing in my ears. I wanted to call out, to ask if he was awake, but something stopped me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't supposed to, like speaking would draw something's attention. After what felt like hours, I must have fallen into a restless sleep. When I woke, the sun was up, and the forest had returned to its normal self. Birds chirping, the wind rustling the trees, as if the night before had been a bad dream. Mark was already up, making coffee by the fire, seemingly oblivious to the unease gnawing at me. We spent the day hiking deeper into the woods, exploring, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The whole time, I felt eyes on me, like the forest itself was observing, waiting. There were moments when the wind would pick up and I could swear I heard my name again, carried on the breeze. Each time I stopped, scanning the trees, but there was nothing. No one. By the time we got back to camp, the sun was beginning to set again. I dreaded the night. Mark, on the other hand, seemed unfazed, laughing and joking as we cooked dinner over the fire. I wanted to tell him what I'd heard, but I didn't. I didn't want him to think I was losing it. That night, as soon as darkness fell, the oppressive silence returned. It was like the forest was holding its breath, waiting. I lay in my tent, wide awake, every muscle tense, straining to hear anything. And then it came. Not a whisper this time, but a slow, deliberate sound. Footsteps. Crunch. 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 They were slow, purposeful, circling the camp. I held my breath, listening. The steps were too heavy to be an animal, too deliberate. I sat up, my heart pounding, and reached for the zipper of my tent. But I stopped. The footsteps had stopped too. Right outside my tent. For what felt like an eternity, I sat there listening, waiting. Then, just as suddenly as they had started, the footsteps moved away, disappearing into the trees. I didn't sleep after that. When morning finally came, I stumbled out of my tent, bleary-eyed and on edge. Mark's tent was open, but he wasn't there. I called out his name, but there was no answer. I circled the camp, looking for any sign of him. Nothing. I started to panic, my mind racing. Had he gone to get help? Was he messing with me? I had no idea, but I couldn't stay there any longer. I packed up my gear, trying to stay calm, and started hiking back toward the truck. The whole way I felt like I was being followed, but every time I turned around, there was nothing. Just trees. Endless, suffocating trees. When I finally reached the truck, I felt a wave of relief. I threw my pack in the back and reached for the door. But then I stopped, frozen in place. There, on the driver's side window, was a handprint. Not just any handprint, Mark's. I'd recognize his wedding band anywhere. The thing is, it wasn't on the outside. It was on the inside. And scrawled in the dirt below it, scratched into the window with something sharp, was a single word. Jake. My blood ran cold. I hadn't seen him leave camp. I hadn't heard him. But somehow, he had beaten me back here. Or, whatever was pretending to be him had. I slowly backed away from the truck, feeling the weight of the forest closing in around me. I was alone, completely, utterly alone. I turned and ran. I've worked as a park ranger for the last 12 years, mostly in small remote areas where tourists rarely venture. But recently, I got transferred to Red Creek National Park, a place with an unsettling reputation. People talk about the area like it's cursed. Whispered stories of strange disappearances, eerie sounds at night, and sightings of things that don't belong in any normal forest. It didn't bother me at first. I'm a rational guy. I don't buy into ghost stories, and I've been in the woods long enough to know that people's imaginations run wild when they're alone out here. But I wasn't prepared for what I'd experienced during my first week at Red Creek. The park is thick with towering pines, their branches intertwining overhead like a living roof that blocks out the sky. It's beautiful, but there's something claustrophobic about it. The silence is almost oppressive. No birds, no animals, just the sound of your own breathing and the occasional crackle of leaves underfoot. It's the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're intruding on something ancient. On my third night, I was assigned to patrol the northern perimeter near Dead Man's Bluff, a cliffside that plunges straight down into a deep gorge. The place got its name from an old legend about a hiker who went missing there years ago. They never found his body. People say he still roams the woods, lost, calling for help in the dead of night. I left the ranger station just before dusk, radio in hand, flashlight clipped to my belt. The hike out to the bluff was about an hour, mostly through dense forest. As the sun began to sink behind the trees, the temperature dropped and the shadows stretched longer, turning the forest into a maze of shifting darkness. That's when I heard it. A faint whispering sound carried on the breeze. At first I thought it was just the wind moving through the pines, but the more I listened, the more distinct it became. It wasn't random. It was like voices, multiple voices whispering in unison, too low for me to make out the words. I stopped, scanning the trees around me. Nothing, just the endless stretch of forest and the creeping darkness. But the whispering continued, just on the edge of my hearing, like it was coming from all directions at once. A chill ran down my spine and I picked up the pace, trying to shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over me. As I neared Dead Man's Bluff, the whispering faded, replaced by a different sound, the crunch of footsteps on dry leaves. They weren't mine. I froze, listening. The footsteps were coming from somewhere behind me, slow and deliberate. Someone, or something, was following me. "Who's there?" I called, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet. No response, just the soft rustle of leaves and the distant hum of the wind. I turned, my hand instinctively reaching for the flashlight. I shined the beam into the trees, sweeping it back and forth. The light cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but the gnarled trunks of the pines and the thick underbrush. But the footsteps stopped. I held my breath, listening. The silence was thick, heavy, like the entire forest was holding its breath along with me. And then, a sound. A soft, almost imperceptible voice, close enough to make my blood run cold. "Help me!" It was a whisper, barely audible, but it was there. Someone, or something, was out there, calling to me. But there was no one in sight, just the trees, looming like silent sentinels in the fading light. I should have turned back right then. I should have radioed for backup, reported the strange noises, and gone back to the safety of the ranger station. But I didn't. Some part of me, the part that had heard the stories about Dead Man's Bluff, needed to know what was out there. I continued on, my steps quicker now, my eyes darting to the shadows that seemed to shift with every movement. The bluff was just ahead, the edge of the cliff visible through a break in the trees. I approached cautiously, my pulse pounding in my ears. The moment I reached the cliff's edge, everything went still. The wind stopped, the whispering ceased, and the forest fell into an unnatural silence. The gorge below was a black void, impossible to see into with the growing darkness, but I didn't need to see it to feel the weight of something watching me. That's when I heard the voice again. "Help me." It was louder this time, clearer, as if the speaker was standing right next to me. My heart pounded, and I spun around, shining the flashlight wildly into the trees. And there, standing just at the edge of the light, was a figure. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. His clothes were torn, his skin pale, and his eyes. His eyes were hollow, empty sockets that stared straight through me. He stood motionless, lips barely moving as the same phrase repeated over and over. "Help me." I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the rocks at the cliff's edge. My mind raced, trying to process what I was seeing, but before I could react, the figure moved. It didn't walk. It glided, unnaturally fast, closing the distance between us in an instant, and then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, It was gone. The whispering returned, louder now, a cacophony of voices surrounding me, suffocating me. Panic surged through me. I bolted, running blindly through the trees, the beam of my flashlight bouncing wildly in the darkness. The voices followed, growing louder, more insistent. "Help me! Help me!" I didn't stop until I reached the clearing where my truck was parked, panting, my chest tight with fear. I threw myself inside, locking the doors, and sat there, shaking, listening to the pounding of my heart. The voices had stopped, but the feeling of being watched lingered. I drove back to the station as fast as the narrow, winding road would allow. When I finally got there, I sat in the truck for a long time, staring into the darkness, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The next morning, I reported the incident to my supervisor. He didn't say much, just nodded and told me to take a few days off if I needed them. But as I left his office, he gave me a look that told me he knew exactly what I'd encountered. I never went back to Dead Man's Bluff after that night. I couldn't. But sometimes when I'm out in the park, I still hear it. That soft, haunting whisper. "Help me." And I know, whatever is out there, it's still waiting, still watching. But I won't be going back. Not ever. I never liked the idea of camping alone. The isolation of it, the vulnerability of being surrounded by miles of forest and no one to call for help. But when Lily left me, after 3 years together, I just needed to get away, to clear my head, to be somewhere that the chaos of city life couldn't touch me. So, I found a remote spot online, deep in the northern wilderness, miles from any main road. It sounded perfect. Just me, the trees, and the quiet. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sky bruised with dusk, the air cool with the approaching night. The pine trees loomed like ancient sentinels, their thick trunks twisting high above, casting long shadows across the mossy ground. There was no sound but the occasional whisper of wind weaving through the branches, a soft rustling like distant whispers. Setting up camp was quick. Tent staked, fire started, and everything arranged. I sat there, staring into the flames, watching the wood crackle and pop, the orange light flickering across the clearing. For the first time in weeks, I felt something close to peace. The sun had long disappeared, the fire now the only light around me, throwing shadows across the trees. I should have felt relaxed. I should have enjoyed the solitude. But instead a strange sense of unease crept in. The woods felt too quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the heavy, stifling kind, like the world was holding its breath. No birds, no crickets, just stillness. I shook it off. Just being paranoid, I muttered to myself, staring into the dancing flames. The loneliness was getting to me. A crack sounded from the tree line behind me, a branch snapping. I turned, heart jumping, flashlight in hand. I swept the beam across the trees, eyes straining to catch movement. Nothing, just dense forest, thick with shadows. I told myself it was a deer or some other harmless animal, but my gut tightened. It felt wrong. "Get a grip," I whispered to myself, returning to the fire. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Then I heard it, faint, barely audible. A whisper. At first I thought it was the wind, but no. It was clearer than that. Like someone speaking softly, just on the edge of my hearing. I stood up, my skin prickling. "Hello?" My voice sounded small, swallowed by the trees. The whisper stopped. I scanned the darkness with my flashlight again. Nothing moved, no signs of life, just my mind playing tricks on me. I forced myself to sit back down, focusing on the warmth of the fire, the crackling of the wood. Maybe I was hearing things, or maybe the isolation was just messing with me. The mind does strange things when it's left to wander, right? But then, a few minutes later, the whispering started again. This time it was closer. I stood turning in a slow circle, trying to pinpoint the source. It was coming from beyond the trees, just out of sight. A low, murmuring sound like someone talking to themselves. I took a deep breath, trying to steady the hammering in my chest, and called out again, "Who's there?" No answer, just the faint, unintelligible whispering. I should have packed up right then and there, hiked back to my car, and gotten the hell out of those woods, but I didn't. Stubborn maybe, or maybe too curious for my own good. Instead, I grabbed the flashlight, took a deep breath, and stepped into the trees. The light barely cut through the darkness, casting long shadows on the forest floor. I walked slowly, carefully, the whispering growing louder the deeper I went. My heart pounded in my ears, but I couldn't stop. I felt like I had to know what it was, like it was pulling me in. And then suddenly the whispering stopped. The silence was deafening. I swung the flashlight around, desperate to see what was lurking just out of sight, but the beam only illuminated the twisted trunks of trees and the dense undergrowth. I turned to head back to the camp when I saw it, a shape. At first I thought it was just another shadow, a trick of the light, but then it moved. My breath caught in my throat as I pointed the flashlight toward it. Standing between two trees was a figure. It was human-shaped, but wrong. Its body was too thin, too tall, its limbs long and gaunt, like it had been stretched out. Its face, God, its face was the worst. Pale, expressionless, with hollow eyes that stared right at me, unblinking. Its mouth hung open, as if frozen mid-whisper. I stumbled backward, my foot catching on a root, and I fell hard onto the ground. The flashlight rolled from my hand, casting erratic beams of light across the forest floor. I scrambled to grab it, but when I pointed it back at the spot where the figure had been, it was gone. I bolted to my feet and ran, crashing through the trees, branches whipping against my face. I didn't stop until I was back at the campsite, chest heaving, sweat chilling my skin. I stood there panting, listening. The whispering had stopped, but the woods felt heavier now, like the trees were closing in, watching me. My gut screamed at me to leave, to pack up and run, but something kept me rooted in place. Then I saw it, just at the edge of the firelight, standing between the pines. That same figure, but this time there were more of them, 5, maybe 6, all standing in a loose circle around the clearing, their pale faces barely visible in the flickering firelight, mouths hanging open, whispering. I could feel their eyes on me, unblinking, cold. I backed toward the tent, my hands shaking, eyes darting from one figure to the next. My heart pounded so loudly I could barely hear anything else. Then, as if responding to my fear, the whispering grew louder, clearer. I finally understood what they were saying. They were calling my name. How could they know my name? I froze. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. Suddenly the fire died out, plunging the clearing into darkness. And that's when I felt it, cold, bony fingers brushing against the back of my neck. I turned to run, but it was too late. I was no longer alone in the woods. I had never been alone. And now I was theirs. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend, just me, my tent, and the silence of the wilderness. I'd been camping for years, and I knew the spots that guaranteed seclusion, where you could be miles away from another soul. Pine Hollow was one of those places. Nestled deep in the forest, it was a small clearing surrounded by towering pines that stretched high into the sky, their dark needles swaying gently in the wind. Perfect, I thought. Exactly what I needed. The first night started off serene. The campfire crackled softly as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows between the trees. I could hear the distant chirping of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. Nothing unusual, just nature doing its thing. The sky was pitch black now, save for the small pinpricks of stars that peeked through the gaps in the canopy above. I crawled into my sleeping bag and zipped up my tent, feeling that familiar sense of calm wash over me. But that calm didn't last long. Around midnight I woke up to a noise outside the tent, a low rustling sound like someone or something was moving through the underbrush just outside. I listened closely, heart thudding in my chest, telling myself it was probably a raccoon or a deer. It was too faint to be anything larger, too inconsistent to be a person. I convinced myself it was nothing and rolled over, trying to fall back asleep. That's when I heard it, a faint whispering. It was so quiet at first I thought it was the wind, but then it became clearer. Soft voices, like a conversation being carried on the breeze. They were coming from just beyond the tree line, too far away for me to make out the words, but close enough to send a shiver down my spine. I sat up, straining my ears to catch more, but the whispers stopped, as if they knew I was listening. I told myself I was imagining things, that the isolation was getting to me. But when I unzipped the tent and peeked out, the fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting eerie shadows across the campsite. The forest was still, too still. No crickets, no wind, nothing. Just silence. I quickly zipped the tent back up and laid down, pulling my sleeping bag up to my neck like a kid afraid of the dark. My mind raced, but eventually, exhaustion took over and I drifted into a restless sleep. The next morning, everything felt off. The air was heavy, like it had a weight to it, pressing down on me. The trees around my campsite seemed darker, more foreboding, and every now and then I could swear I saw movement in the corners of my vision. But when I turned to look, nothing. The whole forest felt like it was watching me. I decided to explore a bit, hoping to shake the unease. As I wandered deeper into the woods, I found something strange. A circle of stones, arranged in a perfect ring, with charred bits of wood in the center. It looked like an old fire pit, but it hadn't been there the day before. I'd scouted this area thoroughly when I set up camp. There was no way I could have missed it. Suddenly, the forest around me felt suffocating. The trees, once majestic, now seemed to loom over me, their twisted branches reaching down like claws. I felt exposed, vulnerable, like I wasn't supposed to be there. The whispering started again, faint and distant but unmistakable. This time it sounded like it was coming from all directions, as if the forest itself was speaking in hushed tones. I ran back to camp, heart pounding, only to find that things had been moved. My backpack, which I had left inside my tent, was now lying next to the fire pit, open, with all of its contents spilled out. My water bottles had been emptied, and my food was scattered across the ground, untouched by animals. It was as if someone had gone through my things and then left, deliberately trying to unnerve me. I knew I had to leave. I hastily packed up my gear and started hiking back to the trailhead. The forest seemed to close in around me as I walked, the whispering growing louder, more insistent. Every now and then, I'd hear a twig snap behind me, but when I turned around, there was nothing there, just trees standing silent and still. As I neared the edge of Pine Hollow, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the dirt, just ahead of me, were footprints, bare, human footprints. They were fresh, the edges of the prints still crumbling. I knelt down to get a closer look, and that's when I realized something horrifying. The footprints were mine, but they weren't leading back the way I had come. They were leading deeper into the forest, back towards my campsite. I stood up, heart racing, and took a step backward. The whispering was louder now, almost deafening, like a chorus of voices just beyond my hearing. I looked down at the trail again, and my footprints were gone. The dirt was smooth, untouched, as if no one had ever walked there. Panic surged through me and I ran. I didn't care about the trail anymore, I just ran, branches whipping at my face, the whispering growing louder and louder until it felt like it was inside my head. I could hear my own breath, ragged and desperate, mixing with the voices. I don't know how long I ran before I broke through the tree line, stumbling onto the gravel road where my car was parked. The forest behind me was still, silent once more, but I didn't trust it. I jumped into my car and sped down the road, not daring to look back. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. There, standing at the edge of the woods, was me. Or at least it looked like me. Same clothes, same face, same eyes. But it was just standing there, watching, with a cold, empty expression, unmoving as I disappeared into the distance. I've never been back to Pine Hollow, but sometimes, late at night when the wind is just right, I swear I can still hear the whispering. And every now and then, I catch a glimpse of someone in the mirror, a figure standing just behind me with my face, but I know it's not me, not really. I love camping, Or at least I used to. There's something about being deep in the woods, surrounded by nothing but the sounds of rustling leaves and the distant hoot of an owl, that always made me feel free. It's a way to escape the noise, the chaos, the demands of life. But that's what I thought before that night. Before I discovered that sometimes isolation isn't peaceful. It's terrifying. Last fall, I decided to camp solo for the first time. I'd done it with friends plenty of times, but I wanted to challenge myself, prove I could survive a weekend alone with just a tent, a fire, and the woods. I chose a remote site tucked miles away from the nearest town. No cell service, no people, just me and nature. That first day was perfect. I hiked, collected firewood, and watched the sun dip beneath the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. I set up my tent just on the edge of a small clearing. The trees surrounding me were dense, their branches intertwined like twisted fingers reaching toward the sky. It was serene. But as the darkness settled in, I started to feel it, this thickness in the air, a weight that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It was subtle at first. I brushed it off as paranoia, the mind playing tricks in the isolation. But as the night went on, that weight grew heavier. I sat by the fire staring into the flames when I first heard it, a soft rustling in the trees just beyond the light of the fire. At first I thought it might be a deer, maybe a raccoon. Normal forest sounds, right? But then the rustling stopped, and there was a silence, so complete that even the chirping crickets fell quiet. Then it started again, slow footsteps, deliberate, coming closer. My heart started to race as I strained to listen. I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Hello? Is someone there?" No response. The footsteps continued just beyond the tree line circling my camp. They were too heavy for a small animal, too quiet for something large like a bear. They were human, or at least I thought they were. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and shined it into the trees. Nothing. The light caught only the trunks of the tall pines and the tangled underbrush, but the sound persisted, moving slowly, deliberately around the perimeter of my camp. I should have left right then, packed up my stuff and bolted, but I didn't. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just my mind, my imagination. That's when I noticed the smell. It was faint at first, something damp, rotting, like wet earth mixed with decay. It drifted in on the breeze, wrapping around me, suffocating. My stomach churned and I had to fight the urge to gag. And then I saw it. At the edge of the firelight, just within the shadows, something moved. It was so quick, I almost thought I'd imagined it. A shape, a figure, ducking behind a tree. My pulse quickened as I aimed my flashlight again, the beam shaking in my trembling hands. There, a pale face peeking from behind the trunk just long enough for me to register its unnatural stillness. Its eyes, wide, hollow, and too dark, stared directly at me. The face didn't belong to any animal. It didn't even look human. It darted back into the darkness before I could react. I stood frozen, the flashlight beam dancing across the trees. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had seen, but it couldn't. It was all wrong. Its features too gaunt, its movements too fast, too twisted. The footsteps picked up again, now faster, almost frantic, circling me in the darkness. And then the whispers started. Faint, unintelligible, but unmistakably there. They came from all directions, soft voices overlapping each other as if multiple people were murmuring just out of sight. I spun in place, the flashlight doing nothing to pierce the oppressive dark. I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened as the whispers grew louder, closer, until it felt like they were right beside me. "Stop! Stop!" I screamed, stepping back toward the fire, desperate for the warmth, the light, the safety. The whispers stopped, the footsteps stopped. Everything went completely silent again, and then I heard it, right behind me. A voice, clear and cold, whispering in my ear, "Run." I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed my bag, ditched the tent, and bolted. I ran blindly into the woods, my flashlight bouncing wildly, barely illuminating the narrow path ahead. Branches clawed at my face and arms as I stumbled through the underbrush, gasping for breath, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The footsteps followed, but now they weren't circling, they were chasing. I could hear them right behind me, closer with every step, and that smell. God, it was so much stronger now. The air was thick with it, choking me, making my eyes water as I sprinted through the forest. I don't know how long I ran. It felt like hours, my legs burning, lungs screaming for air. But somehow, I reached my car. I fumbled with the keys, hands shaking uncontrollably, and finally threw myself inside, locking the doors. For a moment I sat there, panting, staring into the trees, expecting to see someone, burst from the darkness. But there was nothing, just the stillness of the woods. The engine roared to life, and I sped down the narrow dirt road, glancing in my rearview mirror every few seconds. As the distance between me and the campsite grew, the oppressive feeling started to lift. I almost let out a breath of relief. Almost. And then, as I turned onto the highway, I glanced one last time in the rearview mirror. Something was sitting in my back seat. Pale face, wide dark eyes staring back at me. The whispers returned. I've always been a bit of an outdoors enthusiast. There's something about getting away from the noise of daily life, from people and technology, that brings me peace. That's why I decided to take a solo trip out to Silent Lake, a place deep in the wilderness that I had heard about only from whispers among fellow campers. A hidden gem, they called it. No marked trails, no phone signal, and no one around for miles. Perfect. The hike to the lake was longer than I expected. I set out early in the morning, but it wasn't until late afternoon that I caught the first glimpse of the water through the thick trees. The lake lived up to its name. Still and silent, the water was smooth as glass, reflecting the sky above like a mirror. Not a ripple, not a breeze. It was unnerving, but beautiful in its own way. I set up camp on the shore just a few feet from the water's edge. The air was thick with the scent of pine, and the only sound came from the occasional chirp of birds and the soft crackle of my campfire. The lake was so quiet it almost felt oppressive, like the whole place was holding its breath. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the silence deepened. I ate a quick dinner, and as night closed in, I felt a creeping unease settle in my bones. I tried to shrug it off. Maybe I wasn't used to this level of isolation, but something about the stillness felt wrong. That's when I noticed the first strange thing. There were no stars. The sky above was clear, a dark velvet curtain, but no stars blinked through it. The moon should have been out too, but it was nowhere to be seen. The lake reflected nothing but blackness. I stared up, confused, feeling the oddest sensation that I was being watched. It was a ridiculous thought, of course. There was no one else for miles. But I couldn't shake it. That night I barely slept. The air was too still, the quiet too heavy. I kept hearing small sounds, the rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig. But every time I looked around, there was nothing. Just the same still dead lake. I woke early the next morning, hoping that the daylight would chase away the uneasy feeling that had taken root in my gut. But the moment I unzipped my tent, I froze. Footprints. All around my tent, circling it in wide, uneven arcs, were footprints. Bare feet, pressed deep into the soil, leading from the forest to the edge of the lake and back again. They weren't mine. I had worn hiking boots all day, and these were fresh, like someone had been walking around my camp while I slept. I stood there for a moment, staring at the lake. Its surface was just as smooth as the day before. No sign of anyone or anything near it. I wanted to believe it was some weird prank, that maybe I had stumbled into some other camper's territory without realizing it. But the longer I looked at the footprints, the less human they seemed. The toes were too long, the arch too high, the shape slightly off. I packed up my things quickly, deciding to leave as soon as possible. but as I stuffed my tent into my backpack, I glanced back at the lake, and I swear something was standing there, not at the edge, but in the middle of the water. It was just a shadow at first, an indistinct figure barely visible through the early morning mist. It didn't move, didn't splash. It was just there, standing on the water like it belonged. I blinked, and it was gone. I didn't think twice. I grabbed my gear and started back up the trail, desperate to get away from that strange, suffocating silence. The hike back felt slower somehow. Every few steps, I had the unsettling sense that the path was longer than before, stretching out unnaturally in front of me. The trees loomed closer, their branches clawing at me like bony fingers. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, I half expected to see something lurking just behind me, watching, waiting. About halfway back to my car, I realized something even more disturbing. The forest had gone silent too. The birds, the wind, even the crunch of leaves beneath my feet, all of it was gone. The silence was so absolute, it felt like being underwater. My own breathing became a deafening roar in my ears. I quickened my pace, trying to shake off the feeling that the forest itself was closing in on me. I thought I was safe when I finally reached the clearing where I'd parked. But as I approached the car, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There were more footprints. They weren't like the ones around my tent. These were larger, deeper, and there were more of them. Dozens, maybe. They crisscrossed the dirt around my car, leading from the tree line to the driver's door and back again, as though something or someone had been pacing around waiting for me. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys. I just needed to get out of there, to drive as far away as possible. I slid into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and turned the key. The engine roared to life, but in the rear-view mirror I saw something standing at the edge of the clearing. It was tall, too tall, and its limbs were wrong. They bent at odd angles, its arms hanging unnaturally low. Its face was hidden in shadow, but I could feel its eyes on me, unblinking, watching. I slammed the gas pedal, tearing down the dirt road faster than I should have, but I didn't care. I needed to get away from that thing, from the lake, from the silence. Even now, days later, I can't shake the feeling that something followed me. At night, when the world gets quiet, I hear footsteps outside my window. And sometimes when I glance at the lake in my backyard, I swear I see that shadow again, standing still, just waiting for me to come back. Because once the silence finds you, it never really lets you go. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip, just me, the trees, and the crackling of a campfire. I needed the break. Work had been relentless, and I thought a weekend alone in the woods would clear my head. You know, reconnect with nature, find some peace. The drive took me deep into the mountains, far from the city's noise, far from everything really. I didn't want the usual crowded campgrounds, so I found a spot online, a secluded site off the beaten path, a place where I could really disconnect. No cell service, no other campers, just solitude. It sounded perfect. I arrived just before dusk. The forest was already quiet, almost unnaturally so. It felt like the trees were holding their breath, waiting for nightfall. But I shrugged it off. This is what I came for. I set up my tent, got a fire going, and settled into my chair with a book. The sound of the fire crackling was soothing, a welcome change from the constant hum of the city. But as the night deepened, that peacefulness began to feel wrong. It started small. A faint rustling in the bushes, like something was moving around just beyond the tree line. I figured it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But the sounds didn't stop. They circled the campsite, slow and deliberate, as if whatever it was watching me. I told myself it was nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. As the fire dimmed, the woods grew darker, the kind of darkness that swallows you whole. I stoked the fire and tried to read, but my eyes kept drifting to the shadows just beyond the light. That's when I heard it. A whisper. At first I thought it was the wind, but it was too distinct, too human. Words I couldn't make out, carried on the breeze. I froze, straining to hear, but the whispering stopped. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I scanned the darkness, but there was nothing, just the firelight flickering against the trees. I decided it was time to turn in. Maybe I was just letting my mind get the better of me. After all, I was out here alone, in unfamiliar territory. My tent felt like a safe haven, a thin barrier between me and whatever was out there. But that feeling didn't last long. In the dead of night, I woke to a sound, a low guttural noise like breathing. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. I lay there, holding my breath, listening. The sound grew louder, more defined. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, crunching through the underbrush. Something, or someone, was out there. My heart pounded in my chest. I wanted to believe it was just an animal, but deep down I knew it wasn't. I could feel it. Something was wrong. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent, moving as quietly as I could. My hands were shaking as I stepped out into the cold night air. The fire had long since died, leaving only the faint glow of embers. I swung the beam of my flashlight across the trees, my breath coming out in sharp, panicked gasps. Nothing. But that's when I saw it. At the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of my light, stood a figure. Tall and unmoving. It looked like a person, but something was off. Its limbs were too long, its posture too rigid, and its eyes, God, its eyes glowed in the dark, reflecting the beam of my flashlight like an animal's. But it wasn't an animal. It was watching me. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. My mind screamed at me to do something, but I was frozen, locked in place by those glowing eyes. Then, without warning, it started moving toward me. Not walking, gliding. Its movements were unnatural, jerky, like a puppet on strings. And the whispering returned, louder this time, more insistent. The words were clearer now, but they didn't make sense. They were wrong, twisted, like someone speaking a language that didn't belong in this world. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet as I fumbled for the tent zipper. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely grip it. I finally managed to get inside and zipped it up, but I knew it wouldn't help. That thing was out there, just beyond the thin layer of fabric. I could hear it now, moving around the tent, its breath rasping in the darkness. I held my breath, waiting for it to come inside, to tear through the canvas and drag me out. But it never did. The footsteps circled the tent again, slower this time, more deliberate, like it was toying with me. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, the sound stopped. Silence. Deafening, suffocating silence. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I just sat there clutching my flashlight, waiting for the sun to rise. And when it finally did, I packed up as fast as I could and got the hell out of there. But as I threw my gear into the car, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were no tracks, no footprints, nothing to suggest anyone or anything had been there at all. The ground was undisturbed, as if I had imagined the whole thing. But I hadn't. I knew what I saw. I sped out of those woods, my heart pounding, my mind racing. But the further I got from that campsite, the more things didn't add up. I kept thinking about that thing, the whispers, and those eyes. And then it hit me. I wasn't alone when I got there. I had passed a sign just off the trail before I found my spot. It was old, worn down, but I remember what it said now. Campground closed due to unexplained disappearances. This place wasn't on the map by accident, and as I sped down the mountain road, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw a pair of glowing eyes staring back at me from the trees. I wasn't planning on camping alone. In fact, I had made this trip with 3 friends, but life had a way of throwing curveballs. Work emergencies, family obligations. One by one, they dropped out. I should have canceled the trip, but something about the idea of spending a few nights alone in the forest felt liberating, like I needed the quiet. So, with my gear packed and a weekend of solitude ahead, I set off. I found the perfect spot, miles from the nearest road. It was remote, even for seasoned campers. The trees here grew thicker, the branches twisted together like ancient arms reaching for each other. The air was heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth, and when I turned off the engine, the silence was immediate and absolute. No hum of traffic, no distant murmur of people. Just the forest and me. Setting up camp was uneventful. The tent went up easily, the fire pit built from stones I found nearby, and before I knew it, dusk was settling in. The sun dipped behind the tree line, casting long, deep shadows across the ground. I sat by the fire, eating a quick meal, enjoying the crackle of the flames. That's when I first heard it. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct, a faint whisper of a sound, like the rustle of fabric. It came from behind me, somewhere deep in the trees. I turned, scanning the darkening forest, but saw nothing. Probably just an animal, I told myself, a deer or a rabbit maybe. I pushed the thought aside and settled back by the fire. But it came again. This time it was closer. A soft shuffling like footsteps moving through the underbrush. I stood up, shining my flashlight toward the sound, the beam cutting through the gloom. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding strange in the stillness. No answer, just the quiet crackling of the fire behind me. I felt a prickle of unease, but convinced myself it was nothing. I had been camping enough times to know that sounds carried weirdly in the forest. I was probably spooking myself. Night came fully, the stars blinking into view through gaps in the tree canopy. I tried to relax, but that sense of being watched crept in. The firelight flickered, casting strange, dancing shadows on the trees. It felt like the forest was shifting, rearranging itself in the darkness. I shook off the feeling and retreated to my tent. I crawled into my sleeping bag, the nylon walls of the tent providing a false sense of security. The forest outside was deathly quiet now, not even the usual nighttime chorus of crickets and owls. I lay there for what felt like hours, staring up at the ceiling of the tent, listening to the oppressive silence. And then the whispering started. It was so faint at first I thought I was imagining it. A soft, almost rhythmic murmur like voices too far away to make out. I held my breath, straining to hear. It was coming from outside, moving slowly around the tent. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. I fumbled for my flashlight, flicking it on and pointed it at the tent walls. The light shone through the thin fabric, illuminating the immediate area outside. But I saw nothing. No shapes, no shadows. Just the dim glow of the trees and the flickering remnants of the campfire outside. The whispering stopped. I exhaled, trying to steady my breathing, telling myself it was just the wind, the fire, my imagination. But I wasn't convinced. Something was off. I debated whether to go outside and check, but the thought of stepping into the pitch-black forest alone was unsettling. I lay back down, gripping the flashlight tightly. The beam still pointed toward the tent walls. That's when I saw it, the silhouette, a faint, blurry outline of a figure standing just outside the tent. Not moving, just standing there. My breath caught in my throat. I sat frozen, staring at the shape, unable to move. It was too dark to make out any details, but the figure was unmistakably human. Tall, motionless, its head slightly cocked to one side like it was listening. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. No response. The figure didn't move. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest, my palms slick with sweat. I tightened my grip on the flashlight, debating whether to unzip the tent and confront whatever or whoever it was. And then, as suddenly as it appeared, the figure was gone. Just gone. I blinked, convinced I had just imagined it. But I knew I hadn't. I waited for what felt like an eternity, but the forest outside remained quiet. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Morning came slowly, the light filtering through the trees like a promise of safety. I crawled out of the tent, exhausted but eager to leave. I packed up my gear in record time, not bothering to sit down for breakfast. The events of the night still weighed heavily on me, but I wanted to believe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. As I prepared to leave, I noticed something strange. In the soft dirt, right outside my tent, were footprints. But they weren't like any footprints I'd ever seen. They were human, mostly, but twisted. The toes were long, almost claw-like, and the stride was unnaturally wide, like whatever had been standing there was stretching its limbs beyond what was normal. A chill ran down my spine. I grabbed my gear and bolted for my car, leaving the campsite behind without a second glance. But as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me, following me. The forest receded in the rearview mirror, but that sense of being observed remained, clinging to me like a shadow. Weeks passed. I tried to forget about it, chalk it up to a bad experience, a weird night in the woods. But then, 2 nights ago, I woke up in my bed, heart racing, covered in sweat. And there, in the dark corner of my bedroom, I saw it again. That same figure, tall, motionless, watching me from the shadows. I flicked on the light, and it was gone. I haven't slept since, and I'm starting to realize something I should have known all along. I didn't leave the forest alone. I had never been the kind of person who camped alone. It wasn't out of fear. I wasn't some easily spooked city kid. I just preferred having someone with me to share the silence, the stars, the crackling fire. But when my girlfriend and I broke up, I found myself craving isolation. A weekend alone in the woods seemed like the perfect way to clear my head. So I borrowed a tent, packed my gear, and drove 2 hours into the mountains, to a spot I'd heard about from some hikers online. It was a remote location, deep in a forest where the trees grew thick and the trails were barely marked, perfect for some time away from everything. The drive up was uneventful, the sun was still high, the road was dusty, and the sky was a clear, deep blue. As I drove further from civilization, my mind started to relax. No more distractions, no more people. Just me and nature. I parked at the trailhead, slung my backpack over my shoulders, and started the hike. The trail was rougher than I expected, narrow with roots and rocks jutting out every few steps, but the fresh air and solitude made it worthwhile. By the time I reached the clearing where I'd planned to set up camp, the sun was dipping behind the trees, casting long golden shadows over the ground. I set up the tent quickly, gathered some wood for a fire, and sat down with a sense of satisfaction. It was peaceful, just like I'd wanted. The forest around me was quiet, the air cool and still. I stared at the flames, letting the warmth and the gentle crackling soothe my thoughts. But then, as the sky darkened and the stars started to appear, the quiet became too quiet. The usual forest sounds, the rustling of leaves, the chirping of crickets, had all but vanished. It wasn't something I noticed right away, but when I did, it unsettled me. I brushed it off. It's normal, I told myself. Animals go quiet at night. But the longer I sat there, the more the silence seemed to press in on me, like the forest was holding its breath. Suddenly there was a sound, a distant snap of a branch. I froze, staring into the trees, straining to see past the ring of light from my fire. I saw nothing, just shadows. Probably a deer, I thought. Maybe a raccoon. But the sound came again, closer this time. A deliberate crunch of leaves followed by another like footsteps. Slow, measured. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the stillness. Nothing, just the crackle of the fire. I waited, listening, my heart starting to race. It had to be an animal. There was no way someone else would be out here, not this far off the trail. Then, from the darkness just beyond the reach of the firelight, I heard a voice. Soft, almost a whisper. "Help." My skin went cold. The voice was weak, trembling, like someone was lost or injured. I stood up, peering into the blackness. "Hello? Are you okay? Where are you?" Silence, and I grabbed my flashlight, shining it into the trees. The beam flickered over the trunks and bushes, but there was no one. I swept the light from side to side, my pulse quickening. Please." The voice again, closer now, just at the edge of the clearing. I took a step forward, shining the light toward where I thought the sound was coming from. "I'm here," I called. "Do you need help?" For a long moment there was no response, and then the voice again, so quiet I almost didn't hear it. "Come here." I hesitated. Every instinct told me to stay by the fire, to stay in the light. But the voice, there was something so desperate, so fragile about it. Someone could be hurt, I reasoned. Lost. Alone. Against my better judgment, I stepped toward the trees, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. "Where are you?" I called again. Silence. The only sound was my boots crunching on the leaves. I moved deeper into the woods, away from the fire. The trees were thicker here, the darkness almost suffocating. My flashlight beam flickered, and for a second I thought I saw movement, a shape slipping between the trees, low to the ground. "Hello?" My voice wavered. Then suddenly the voice was behind me. "Closer." I spun around, shining the flashlight back toward the clearing, but there was no one there. Just trees, the faint glow of my campfire in the distance. That's when I realized the voice wasn't coming from a person. It was coming from everywhere. It wasn't one voice, but many, overlapping, whispering, surrounding me. Panic shot through me, and I turned to run back to the fire, but before I could take a step, something cold brushed against my arm. I froze. Slowly, I lifted the flashlight, shining it toward the source of the touch. There in the shadows, just inches from me, was a hand, pale, thin, with fingers too long, reaching out from between the trees. It wasn't attached to a body. It wasn't attached to anything. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my throat. The hand twitched, its fingers curling like it was beckoning me, and then the voice whispering closer than ever. "Stay with us." I turned and ran, my feet barely finding the trail as I sprinted back toward the camp. The whispers followed me, growing louder, more insistent. "Stay. Stay with us." I burst into the clearing, my chest heaving, and scrambled to throw dirt on the fire. The whispers grew frantic, like 1,000 voices all around me, desperate and angry. "Stay, stay!" I grabbed my backpack and ran, not daring to look back. The whispers didn't stop until I reached the car, throwing myself inside and slamming the door shut. As I peeled out of the dirt lot, I could still hear them, faint but clear, carried on the wind through the trees. "Come back." I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, the mountain far behind me. It wasn't until I pulled over on the side of the road, trying to catch my breath, that I realized something was horribly wrong. In the rearview mirror, reflected in the back seat, was the same hand, pale, thin, and waiting. Camping has always been my way of reconnecting with nature, a way to escape the demands of modern life. This time, though, I decided to go somewhere more remote, more isolated than ever before. A hidden gem deep in the heart of an old-growth forest, a place almost entirely untouched by humans. My friend Mark told me about it. He had been once, years ago, but warned me it wasn't for the faint-hearted. "There's something about that place, man," he said before I left. "The woods are different there. Just stay alert." I brushed off his cryptic warning, thinking it was his way of adding some thrill to my trip. I'd camped alone before. I could handle a few spooky stories. So, with my gear packed and my map marked, I drove the 2 hours to the drop-off point and started the hike into the wilderness. The trail was rugged, overgrown in spots like it hadn't been used in years. The forest itself felt dense, older than any I'd been in before. Towering trees blocked out much of the sunlight, and the deeper I went, the quieter everything became. It wasn't the usual peaceful silence of nature, though. It was a heavy, unnatural quiet, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. By late afternoon, I found a suitable clearing to set up camp, a small patch of flat ground surrounded by massive ancient pines. The air was cooler here, the light dim, even though the sun was still up. I built a fire, pitched my tent, and settled in for what I expected to be a calm night under the stars. That calm didn't last long. It started with a sound, barely perceptible at first, like the crack of a branch or the shuffle of leaves. I looked around but saw nothing out of the ordinary. The forest was thick and visibility was limited, but I figured it was just an animal passing through. Still, I kept glancing around, unable to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. As night fell, the temperature dropped sharply. The fire's glow was a comforting barrier against the encroaching darkness, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I chalked it up to nerves. First night jitters, I told myself. I'd be fine by morning. But then, just past midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, circling just beyond the edge of the firelight. I sat up, heart pounding, and grabbed my flashlight. The beam cut through the dark, but there was nothing there. I scanned the trees, the underbrush, the ground, but the forest was empty. Still, the sound persisted. Soft, shuffling footsteps, always staying just out of sight. A chill crawled down my spine. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing eerily through the still night. No response. The footsteps stopped. Silence. The kind of silence that presses down on you, thick and suffocating. I sat there for what felt like hours, gripping the flashlight, every sense on high alert. But nothing happened. No more sounds, no movement. Eventually exhaustion won out, and I crawled back into my tent, though I didn't sleep easily. At some point I must have drifted off because I woke up to the sound of something rustling outside the tent. This time it was right next to me, something moving, brushing against the fabric. My heart was in my throat as I slowly unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The fire had died down to embers, casting a faint orange glow around the campsite. But in the half-light, I saw it. A figure. It was standing at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the firelight. Tall, human-shaped, but wrong somehow. Its limbs were too long, its posture unnatural, like it didn't know how to stand properly. I froze, trying to process what I was seeing, but then it moved. Slowly, unnervingly, it bent forward as if trying to peer into the tent. I slammed the zipper shut and scrambled to the back of the tent, heart hammering so loudly I thought it would burst. For what felt like an eternity, I sat there clutching my knife, listening for any sound of movement outside. But there was only silence. That same oppressive, unnatural silence. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know if it was still out there. I unzipped the tent just a crack and shined the flashlight through. The figure was gone. I bolted out of the tent, flashlight in hand, spinning in circles, scanning the perimeter. Nothing, no sign of it. My campsite looked completely undisturbed. But I knew what I saw. My mind wasn't playing tricks on me. I wasn't that tired. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I kept the fire going, every muscle in my body tense, ready for whatever was lurking in the shadows. As dawn broke, I started packing up. There was no way I was staying another night. I wasn't even sure I could make it back the same way I came, but I didn't care. I just needed to get out of there. As I was breaking camp, I noticed something odd. The ground around my tent, there were no footprints, no sign of anything having been there, but that didn't make sense. I had heard it, seen it. It had been so close. Then I saw the tree. One of the massive pines at the edge of the clearing had deep, jagged scratches carved into the bark, like something had dragged its nails or claws along the trunk. The markings were fresh. My blood ran cold. Whatever it was, it had been real. I grabbed my gear and set off, keeping my pace fast, glancing over my shoulder every few minutes. The forest seemed even quieter now, like it was watching me leave. After what felt like hours of hiking, I reached the trailhead, my car still parked where I'd left it. Relief washed over me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, watching, waiting. Back at home, I told Mark what had happened, expecting him to laugh it off. Instead, his face went pale. "I didn't want to scare you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But the reason I never went back there was because of the same thing, The figure. I thought I was imagining it, that maybe I'd been too tired or freaked myself out. But now... His voice trailed off, and he didn't need to finish the sentence. I haven't been camping since. I don't think I ever will again, but sometimes, late at night, when everything is still and the world is quiet, I swear I can hear the faint sound of footsteps just outside my window, circling, waiting. I've always been drawn to the solitude of camping. The idea of escaping the city's noise and immersing myself in nature's embrace has a certain allure. So, when my friend Mark suggested a weekend camping trip to a remote spot he knew, I was all in. Little did I know, this trip would etch itself into my memory for all the wrong reasons. We set out early on a Friday, driving for hours until the roads turned into dirt paths, and the dirt paths into barely visible trails. Our destination was a secluded clearing nestled between towering pines, miles away from any semblance of civilization. As we arrived, the sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the landscape. It was picturesque, the kind of place that makes you forget about the world. After setting up our tents and gathering firewood, we settled in for the evening. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows around us. We chatted about work, life, and the beauty of the outdoors. As the night deepened, a hush fell over the forest. The only sounds were the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. As I lay in my tent, drifting between wakefulness and sleep, I became aware of a faint sound. At first I thought it was the wind, but it was too rhythmic, too deliberate. It sounded like chanting, soft, echoing chants that seemed to emanate from the trees themselves. I strained to listen, my heart rate quickening. The chants grew louder, more distinct, yet I couldn't make out any words. It was as if the forest was alive with whispered secrets. I glanced over at Mark's tent, but there was no movement. He must be asleep, I thought. I didn't want to disturb him, so I tried to ignore the sounds and get some rest. But sleep eluded me. The chanting continued, ebbing and flowing like a ghostly tide. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were not alone. The next morning, over a breakfast of scrambled eggs and coffee, I mentioned the sounds I had heard. Mark shrugged it off, attributing it to the natural sounds of the forest. Probably just the wind or some nocturnal animals, he said. I wasn't convinced, but I didn't press the issue. Maybe I was overreacting, I told myself. We spent the day hiking and exploring the surrounding area. The forest was dense, with towering trees and a thick underbrush that seemed to swallow sound. As the day wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every rustle in the bushes, every snap of a twig sent a jolt of anxiety through me. Mark, on the other hand, seemed completely at ease, enjoying the tranquility of the woods. That evening, as we sat around the campfire, the atmosphere felt different. The air was heavier, the silence more profound. We talked less, each of us lost in our own thoughts. As the night grew darker, the chanting began again. This time it was louder, more insistent. I could feel the vibrations of the sound in my chest, a low, humming chant that seemed to resonate with the very earth beneath us. I looked at Mark, expecting him to acknowledge the noise, but he remained silent, staring into the fire. "Mark," I whispered, "do you hear that?" He didn't respond. "Mark," I said a bit louder this time. Still no response. I reached out to touch his shoulder, and that's when I noticed it. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow. He was asleep. How could he sleep through this, I wondered. The chanting was so loud now, so pervasive it was impossible to ignore. I stood up, my flashlight in hand, and scanned the perimeter of our campsite. The light penetrated the darkness, illuminating the dense foliage. But I saw nothing out of the ordinary. No figures lurking in the shadows, no signs of life, just the trees standing tall and silent. As I turned to head back to the fire, something caught my eye, a glint of light, like a reflection, deep within the woods. I paused, squinting to get a better look. The reflection grew brighter, moving slowly toward me. My heart raced as I realized it was a pair of eyes glowing in the dark. I froze, my mind racing with possibilities. Was it a wild animal, a person, something else entirely? The eyes continued to approach, and I could hear the faint sound of footsteps, barely audible over the chanting. "Mark," I called out, my voice trembling. No response. The eyes were closer now, and I could make out a shadowy figure behind them. It was tall, with a slender build, and it moved with a grace that seemed unnatural. I backed up slowly, my flashlight trained on the figure, but it continued to advance. "Who are you?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. The figure stopped, its eyes still fixed on me. For a moment there was silence, and then it spoke. Its voice was soft, almost a whisper, but I could hear it clearly. "We are the echoing silence," it said. "We have been waiting for you." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you want?" "To show you the truth," the figure replied, "to reveal what lies beneath." Before I could react, the figure raised its hand, and I felt a sudden pressure in my head. The chanting grew louder, filling my mind, drowning out all other thoughts. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The world around me began to fade, and the last thing I saw was the figure standing over me, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. I don't know how long I was unconscious. When I woke, I was lying on the ground, the morning sun filtering through the trees. Mark was nowhere to be seen. I called out for him, but there was no response. I searched the campsite, the surrounding woods, but he was gone. It was as if he had vanished without a trace. I packed up our gear and hiked back to the car, my mind numb with confusion and fear. I drove to the nearest town and reported Mark's disappearance to the authorities. They organized a search party, but no one could find any sign of him. It was as if he had been swallowed by the forest. To this day, I don't know what happened that night. I don't know who or what the echoing silence is. All I know is that I will never forget those eyes, that voice, and the feeling of being utterly alone in the woods. I always thought solo camping was my sanctuary. No distractions, no people, just me and nature. It's the only time I felt truly disconnected from the chaos of daily life. So when I found a map of unmarked campsites deep within the Smoky Mountains, I was eager to explore. The trail was rough, overgrown, and hardly used, but that's what I liked about it. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was already starting to dip behind the trees. I set up camp quickly, a small tent, a fire pit, and a little space to stretch out under the stars. The forest around me was dense, with ancient trees that seemed to tower forever, their leaves creating a thick canopy that made it feel much later than it was. I sat by the fire as twilight deepened into night, the flames casting long shadows over the clearing. It was quiet, eerily so. No crickets, no wind, just the occasional rustle of leaves in the distance. The firelight flickered, dancing off the trees. I leaned back, letting myself sink into the solitude, the peaceful silence of the forest. But then I noticed something strange. Far off in the distance, through the thick trees, there was a light, a small flickering glow. At first I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me, or maybe some sort of reflection from my fire. But it didn't move like that. It was soft, pale, and steady, like an old lantern swaying gently in the breeze. The rational part of my brain told me it was another camper, though it didn't make much sense. The trail was practically non-existent, and I hadn't seen another soul all day. But as the light continued to hover just beyond the trees, curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my flashlight and stood, cautiously walking toward the glow. The air felt heavier as I moved deeper into the woods, the underbrush crunching under my boots. My fire faded behind me, its warm glow swallowed by the shadows. I kept my eyes fixed on the light, weaving through the thick trunks, stepping over fallen logs and rocks. It stayed just far enough away that I couldn't make out who or what was carrying it. Finally, I reached a small clearing, and there it was, the lantern, swaying gently from a low-hanging branch of an oak tree. The light was dim, casting an unnatural pale glow that barely illuminated the ground beneath it. The glass was fogged, cracked in places, and the metal frame was rusted and old, like it hadn't been touched in years. I approached it cautiously, shining my flashlight around the area. There was no one there. No campsite, no trail, nothing. Just the lantern, hanging silently. I reached out to touch it, feeling a cold chill seep into my skin as I got closer. But before my fingers could brush against the glass, the light flickered and then went out. Darkness. I stood there frozen, my breath catching in my throat. My flashlight flickered for a second, the beam cutting in and out, and in that brief moment, I saw something, just for a split second, standing in the shadows at the edge of the clearing, a figure tall and thin with wide hollow eyes staring right at me. The flashlight sputtered back to life, and the figure was gone. My heart pounded in my chest as I stumbled backward, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I spun around, shining the light frantically in every direction, but there was nothing. No tracks, no sound, just the oppressive silence of the forest. I didn't wait to see what else might happen. I bolted back through the trees, tripping over roots and rocks as I rushed toward my campsite. The light from my fire was a distant, welcoming beacon, and I practically threw myself into the clearing, gasping for breath. I stood there panting, my eyes darting around the edge of the forest. For a long time, nothing happened. The fire crackled softly, the air still. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, I thought. Maybe it was some old abandoned lantern from another camper, and I let my imagination run wild. But as I sat down by the fire trying to calm my nerves, I realized something was wrong. The air felt different, heavy, like it was pressing down on me. I looked around, and that's when I saw it. Lanterns. Dozens of them. They were hanging from the trees all around my campsite, each one glowing with that same pale, cold light. They hadn't been there before. I was sure of it. I stood slowly, feeling my heart race as I backed toward my tent. The light swayed gently, as if in sync with some invisible breeze, but the air around me was completely still. My hand shook as I fumbled for my phone, trying to get a signal, but of course there was none. Not out here. I glanced at the forest again, and that's when I saw them. The figures. At first they were barely visible, just dark shapes moving between the trees, slipping in and out of the shadows. But as the lantern swayed, I saw them more clearly. Tall, thin figures with hollow eyes, their faces gaunt and pale, watching me from the edge of the clearing. There were dozens of them, just like the lanterns, their eyes locked on me, unmoving. I backed away, my mind screaming for me to run, but my legs felt heavy, as if the ground itself was holding me in place. One of the figures stepped closer, its face coming into the light. It looked human, but wrong, its skin stretched tight over its bones, its mouth hanging open in a silent scream. It raised one hand slowly, pointing at me. I didn't wait. I grabbed my backpack, left the tent behind, and ran. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get away from those things. The lanterns, the figures. They watched me as I stumbled through the trees, their hollow eyes glowing in the darkness. I ran for what felt like hours, crashing through the underbrush, my lungs burning, until finally I reached the road where I had parked. I jumped into the car, slammed the door shut, and sped off, not daring to look back. I've tried to forget that night, but I can't. Every time I close my eyes, I see those lanterns swaying in the trees, and those figures, watching, waiting. And sometimes, late at night when the wind is just right, I swear I can still see a pale light flickering through the trees outside my window. A lantern. It was supposed to be a simple weekend away, just me, my brother Mark, and a couple days in the wild. We'd been going on camping trips together since we were kids, and every year we pushed a little deeper into the wilderness. This time Mark had found a spot on an old map, miles away from the nearest trailhead, in a part of the forest neither of us had ever been to before. He was excited. I should have listened to that feeling in my gut, telling me something was wrong. We arrived just before sundown, parking the truck at the edge of an old logging road that hadn't seen maintenance in decades. The forest here was thick, wild. The trees were old and gnarled, their trunks wide enough that two people could barely wrap their arms around them. The canopy above was so dense it blocked out the late afternoon sun, casting everything below in deep shadow. "This is perfect," Mark said, grinning as he shouldered his pack. "No one's been out here in ages." I forced a smile. The isolation was a little more intense than I had imagined, but I didn't want to kill the mood. Mark thrived on this kind of thing. He always had, ever since we were kids. I followed him as we made our way deeper into the forest, the ground soft beneath our boots, the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves thick in the air. We found a clearing after about an hour of hiking, just big enough for the two of us to set up our tents. It was quiet, too quiet in retrospect. No birds, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, just the steady sigh of the wind through the trees, and even that was barely a whisper. We built a fire as night fell, its light flickering across the twisted trees at the edge of the clearing. It was cold for early autumn, and the warmth of the fire felt comforting against the growing chill in the air. But that unease from earlier was still there, a prickling at the back of my neck I couldn't shake. As we sat by the fire, talking about old trips and joking around, I noticed something strange. A faint sound, almost like someone whispering. It was so soft that I thought it might have just been the wind, but it was there, just at the edge of hearing. "Do you hear that?" I asked, my voice low. Mark looked at me, frowning. "Hear what?" "That whispering." He paused, listening. The fire crackled in the silence, but there was nothing else. "Just the wind, man," Mark said, shrugging. "This place is getting to you." I tried to brush it off, but the feeling wouldn't go away. The trees seemed to press in on us from all sides, their branches swaying gently despite the lack of any real breeze. And that whispering, it was like it was calling from somewhere deep in the woods, too far away to make out but persistent, like it was getting closer. Mark didn't seem bothered at all. He stoked the fire, talking about all the stuff he wanted to do in the morning, exploring a nearby creek, hiking further into the valley. But I couldn't focus. I kept glancing at the tree line, my eyes scanning for movement. That's when I saw it. Just beyond the reach of the firelight, something moved. A dark shape slipping between the trees. It was quick, almost too fast to notice, but I caught it. A flicker of motion. A shadow that didn't quite fit with the rest of the night. "Mark," I whispered, my throat tight. "There's something out there." He looked at me again, clearly unconvinced, but I couldn't let it go. I stood up, grabbing the flashlight from my pack and pointing it toward the trees. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the rough bark and thick undergrowth. For a moment there was nothing, but then, at the edge of the light, I saw it again. A figure. Tall, impossibly thin, its limbs stretched in ways that didn't make sense. It stood just beyond the reach of the flashlight, unmoving, watching us. "What the hell?" I muttered, backing up. Mark stood up, finally serious. "What? What do you see?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. My mind was racing, trying to process what I was looking at. The figure was standing completely still, its face hidden in shadow, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold, unblinking. And then it moved. Not like a person. It didn't walk. It just shifted. One moment it was there. The next it was closer, like the darkness itself had swallowed the space between us. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, like 100 voices all speaking at once, but none of them were human. "Pack your stuff," I said, my voice shaking. "We need to leave." Mark didn't argue. He must have seen the look on my face, the fear. We moved quickly, breaking camp in a matter of minutes. But as we did, the figure moved too, gliding closer with every second. The whispering surrounded us now, coming from every direction, from the trees, from the ground, from the very air around us. By the time we had everything packed, the figure was at the edge of the clearing. I could see it clearly now. Its limbs were wrong, too long, too thin. Its head was tilted unnaturally to the side, and where its face should have been, there was nothing. just smooth, pale skin stretched tight over bone. We didn't speak. We just ran. The trail back to the truck was a blur of branches and shadows, the whispering following us the entire way. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel it behind me, hear it moving through the trees, closing the distance. When we finally reached the truck, I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking. Mark stood by the passenger door, eyes wide, scanning the dark forest around us. "Hurry," he whispered, and for the first time I heard fear in his voice. I got the door open, and we both jumped in. I started the engine, slamming the truck into reverse, the tires kicking up dirt as we sped down the old logging road, branches scraping against the sides of the vehicle. I kept my eyes on the road, but I could feel it, whatever that thing was, watching us from the trees as we drove away. The whispering didn't fade until we were miles from the campsite, the forest finally giving way to open road and the distant lights of the highway. We didn't talk much after that. I don't think either of us wanted to acknowledge what we'd seen, what had followed us through the woods. But every now and then, late at night, I still hear it, the whispering. And I know deep down it's still out there, waiting. Camping had always been a way for me to reset, to escape the stress and noise of everyday life. This time I needed it more than ever. Work had been suffocating, and the idea of disconnecting in the wilderness was too tempting to pass up. I decided to head out to an old campsite deep in the woods, one I hadn't visited in years. It was a place my friends and I used to go when we were younger, back when life seemed simpler. I packed my gear and set out early, eager to get away from it all. The drive was long and winding, taking me deep into the backcountry where the roads turned to dirt, and the cell signal dropped off completely. Perfect. As I reached the old trailhead, a strange sense of nostalgia washed over me. The entrance was a little more overgrown than I remembered. The wooden sign marking the trail faded and weathered by years of neglect. It didn't bother me, though. In fact, the isolation was exactly what I wanted. The hike in was peaceful, with nothing but the sound of birds and the crunch of leaves beneath my boots. I followed the familiar path, though it seemed less worn now, as if fewer people had passed this way in recent years. It didn't surprise me. Most people wanted more modern campsites with all the amenities. But I wasn't most people. I preferred the solitude, the feeling of being miles away from anyone or anything. After a few hours, I reached the clearing where we used to camp. The place hadn't changed much. Same towering pines, the same view of the mountains in the distance. I set up my tent, made a fire, and settled in for a quiet night. The sun began to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the clearing. I sat by the fire, watching the flames flicker and listening to the forest come alive with the sounds of night. The air cooled quickly, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me, feeling the cold seep in. That's when I noticed it, a path leading off into the trees that I didn't remember. It was narrow, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it, overgrown with ferns and brush. I frowned, trying to recall if it had always been there. I didn't think so. We had explored every inch of this place back in the day, and I was sure I would have noticed something like that. Curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my flashlight and stood up, staring down the trail. It snaked into the forest, disappearing into the dark. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should really go wandering off alone, but then shrugged it off. I had plenty of daylight left, and besides, I'd hiked this area countless times before. What harm could a short walk do? The path was strange. As I walked, I noticed how quiet the forest became. The usual night sounds, the chirping of crickets, the rustling of leaves, seemed to fade away the deeper I went. The trees grew denser, their branches weaving together overhead, blocking out the fading light. I shone my flashlight around, but the beam only seemed to highlight the encroaching darkness. There was something unsettling about the place, like the air was too still, too cold. But I kept walking, drawn deeper by some strange compulsion, as if the path itself was pulling me forward. Then I saw it. A small cabin barely visible through the trees. Its wooden walls were dark with age, the roof sagging and covered in moss. There were no windows that I could see, just a single weathered door hanging slightly ajar. I stopped in my tracks, my heart beating faster. There was no way this had been here before. We had camped near this spot for years, and I'd never seen any signs of a cabin, let alone something this eerie. It looked ancient, like it had been forgotten by time, hidden away from the world. Against my better judgment, I took a step closer. My flashlight flickered as I approached the cabin, the light dimming as if the batteries were dying. I shook it, but the beam remained weak. The door creaked as it swayed slightly in the breeze, the sound low and mournful. I stepped up to the door and peered inside. Darkness. My flashlight barely penetrated the interior, but what little I could see made my skin crawl. The inside of the cabin was barren, just an empty room with a dirt floor and wooden walls blackened with age. But there was something else. A faint scratching sound like nails dragging across wood came from somewhere deep within the cabin. I took a step back, every instinct screaming at me to leave. But before I could turn away, the door creaked open a little more, as if inviting me in. And that's when I saw it. A hand, pale and withered, slipping out from the shadows. It gripped the edge of the doorframe, its fingers long and gnarled, the nails yellow and cracked. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The hand didn't move, just held on to the door as if waiting for me to step closer. I couldn't move, couldn't tear my eyes away from it. Then, slowly, the hand pulled back into the darkness, disappearing into the cabin's interior. The scratching sound grew louder, more frantic. I didn't wait to see what would come next. I turned and bolted down the path, my flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. The trees seemed to close in around me, the air thick with an unnatural cold that burned my lungs as I ran. The path, once narrow but clear, now felt suffocating, as if the forest itself was trying to trap me. I didn't stop until I reached my campsite, breathless and drenched in sweat. The fire had died down to embers, casting weak shadows across the clearing. My heart raced as I glanced back at the dark woods, half expecting to see something, someone, emerging from the trees. But there was nothing. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, keeping it alive, my eyes darting toward the trees, listening for any sign of movement. The scratching sound echoed in my mind, as if it had followed me back from that cursed cabin. At first light, I packed up and left, practically running down the trail toward my car. As I drove away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see that cabin, or something worse, following me. When I got home, I tried to look up information about Moonlit Ridge, the trail, the area, anything that could explain what I'd seen. But there was nothing. No mention of a cabin, no mention of that path. It was as if it didn't exist, but I know what I saw, and sometimes late at night I can still hear it, the faint scratching like nails on wood just outside my window, waiting. I've never been a superstitious guy. Ghost stories, fun to listen to around a campfire, sure. But believing in them? No way. At least not until last summer. What happened in the woods that weekend? I still have trouble explaining it. And no matter how many times I tell the story, the details don't get any less disturbing. It was late August, and 4 of us, me, Jake, Hannah, and Sarah, decided to go camping one last time before summer ended. We picked this secluded spot deep in the pines, miles from the nearest road, where the trees stretched taller than buildings and the air was thick with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. No cell service, no people. Just us and the forest. That was the whole point. The first day was great. We set up our tents, cracked open a few beers, and laughed around the fire until the stars dotted the sky like glitter. But that night, our first night there, is when the strange stuff started happening. It was around midnight when I first heard it. A rustling sound, faint at first, like something moving through the underbrush near our camp. I chalked it up to an animal. We were in the woods, after all. But then I noticed something odd. The forest had gone completely silent. No crickets, no wind, no usual forest sounds, just nothing. Jake must have noticed it too because he glanced at me, his face half lit by the fire, and asked, "You hear that?" I nodded but didn't say anything. The others were still chatting, oblivious. Then, another sound, closer this time, a soft crack, like a branch snapping underfoot. I stood up and grabbed my flashlight. Shining it into the trees, all I saw were towering pines and shadows that stretched unnaturally long, twisting in ways that didn't make sense. "Probably a deer or something," Jake said, though I could hear the unease in his voice. He sat back down, but I kept scanning the tree line. I could have sworn I saw something move. A dark shape slipping between the trees, too quick for me to get a good look. I told myself it was nothing and sat back down, trying to shake the weird feeling creeping up my spine. The next morning we woke up to find that Sarah's backpack was missing. We spent a good hour searching the campsite, thinking maybe she'd just misplaced it, but it was gone. She swore she left it by her tent. "What, did a raccoon drag it off or something?" Sarah muttered, irritated. But the weird part was that nothing else had been touched. Her food, our gear, everything else was right where we left it. That day, things only got stranger. While we were out hiking, I kept seeing these figures. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, a trick of the light maybe. But every time I glanced back at the trail, there'd be a shadow darting between the trees just out of sight, too human-shaped to be an animal. But when I'd turned to get a better look, there was nothing there. I didn't mention it to the others. They were already freaked out enough by the backpack incident. That night the noises started again, louder this time. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the campsite. Hannah was the first to speak up. "Does anyone else hear that?" she whispered, clutching her blanket as she peered into the darkness. Before anyone could answer, there was a soft thud. Something heavy, falling just beyond the firelight. Jake jumped to his feet, his face pale. "Okay, that was not a raccoon," he muttered, grabbing the hatchet we'd used to chop firewood. We all stood there, tense, waiting. The footsteps stopped. The forest was silent again. And then from the shadows we saw it, just for a split second. A figure, standing at the edge of the trees. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs long and thin, almost skeletal. But the worst part? Its face. It didn't have one. Just a smooth, pale surface where a face should be. It stood there motionless, staring. Or at least I think it was staring. Sarah screamed. I don't blame her. The figure vanished into the woods the moment she did. "Did you guys see that?" she shouted, backing toward the fire. "What the hell was that?" No one had an answer. We huddled together by the fire, trying to make sense of it, but there was no sense to be made. The rest of the night, none of us slept. We just sat there, listening, waiting. At dawn, we decided we'd had enough. We packed up camp as fast as we could, eager to get the hell out of there. But when we went to grab the car keys from Jake's tent, they were gone, just like Sarah's backpack. We tore the campsite apart, looking for them, but they weren't there, and that's when we found the footprints, dozens of them, surrounding our camp. They weren't human, not exactly. They were too long, too narrow, with claw-like marks dragging through the dirt. And they led off into the forest, disappearing among the pines. "We need to leave, now," Hannah whispered, her voice trembling. But without the keys, we were stuck. The nearest road was miles away. And then we heard it again, the footsteps, slow, deliberate. But this time they weren't circling the camp. They were coming toward us. In a panic, we grabbed what we could and ran. No plan, no direction, just away. The footsteps followed, growing faster, closer. I could feel something behind us, something cold and wrong, like a presence breathing down my neck. We ran for what felt like hours until finally we broke through the tree line, stumbling onto an old logging road. Somehow, by some miracle, there was an old rusty truck parked there. No one questioned it. We just piled in and Jake hotwired it with shaking hands. As we sped away, I looked back at the tree line. There it was again, that figure, standing just beyond the pines, watching us leave. But this time, it wasn't alone. There were more of them, dozens, all tall, faceless, their heads cocked slightly to the side as if curious. We didn't stop driving until we reached the nearest town. We never spoke about it again. Not really. But every now and then, I catch the others glancing over their shoulders, the same way I do. Because deep down, we all know the truth. Whatever those things were, they weren't just watching us. They were waiting. And I have this sinking feeling that they still are. I never liked camping much, but it wasn't my idea. It was Jake's. He's always been into these rugged, back-to-nature adventures, dragging the rest of us along with him. There were 5 of us that weekend. Me, Jake, Sam, Lily, and Claire. We were all crammed into Jake's beat-up Jeep, winding down a narrow, twisting dirt road that seemed to lead straight into the belly of nowhere. We finally arrived at the campsite in the late afternoon, miles deep in the pine barrens, dense, remote, and eerily silent. The kind of silence that gets under your skin. Not a single bird call, no rustling of small animals. Just nothing. But Jake was thrilled. "Perfect spot," he said with that goofy grin. The rest of us exchanged uncertain glances, but no one wanted to be the first to chicken out. We set up camp near a small clearing surrounded by towering pine trees that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine needles. It was peaceful at first, but there was something off about the place. You know that feeling when you're being watched? I brushed it off as nerves. Being out here, in the middle of nowhere, tends to do that. By nightfall the fire was crackling, and we passed around beers trying to lighten the mood. But something still felt wrong. Sam was the first to notice it. "Do you guys hear that?" he asked, suddenly serious. We all fell silent. There it was, a faint whispering, barely audible, like the wind weaving through the trees. Except there wasn't any wind. We looked at each other, confused. Lily laughed it off, saying it was just our imaginations running wild. But deep down, I could tell none of us believed her. The whispering grew louder as the night dragged on, like voices coming from all directions. But no matter where we looked, we saw nothing but the same black expanse of trees. And the silence between the whispers was suffocating. Jake tried to reassure us. "It's just the forest," he said, throwing another log on the fire. "Nature can play tricks on you when it's this quiet." But something about his voice sounded strained, like he didn't fully believe his own words. We all agreed to turn in for the night, but sleep didn't come easily. The tents felt too thin, too fragile, as if they couldn't protect us from whatever was out there. I lay awake, listening. The whispers were closer now, almost like they were coming from just outside the tent. My breath caught in my throat when I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate, circling our camp. I wasn't the only one who heard them. Jake unzipped his tent and crawled out. I could see his silhouette against the faint glow of the dying fire. "Who's there?" he called out, trying to sound brave. No answer. Suddenly we all heard it, a low guttural growl from the trees. Claire screamed, and in seconds we were all out of our tents, flashlights scanning the darkness. The trees stood like silent sentinels, watching us. That's when I saw it, just at the edge of the light, a figure, hunched and shadowy, barely visible through the dense pines. "Run!" Jake yelled, and we scattered, bolting through the forest without any sense of direction. The only thing that mattered was getting away from whatever was out there. Branches whipped against my face, the forest floor uneven beneath my feet. The growling seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. My legs burned, but I kept running until I couldn't hear the others anymore, couldn't hear anything except my own ragged breathing. That's when I saw it, a small cabin tucked away in the trees. It looked old, abandoned. The windows were dark, and the door hung slightly ajar. I should have kept running, but something drew me to it, like an invisible hand guiding me. Maybe it was desperation, maybe it was curiosity. Either way, I stepped inside. The air was cold, colder than it should have been. My flashlight flickered, casting long shadows across the room. Dust covered everything. An old table, a few wooden chairs, a fireplace filled with ashes long dead. But the thing that stopped me in my tracks was the wall, covered in names, dozens, maybe hundreds of names, scratched into the wood. My heart pounded as I stepped closer. That's when I saw it. Near the bottom of the wall, scratched deep into the wood, were our names: Jake, Sam, Lily, Claire, and mine. I stumbled back, a cold sweat breaking out across my skin. How? How could our names already be here? The door creaked open behind me and I spun around, expecting to see the thing from the woods. But it wasn't. It was Jake, his face pale, eyes wide with fear. "Did you see them too?" he whispered. I didn't have time to ask what he meant. The whispers had returned, louder now, filling the cabin with their eerie, disembodied voices. And then, like a switch flipping, they stopped. Silence. Jake and I stood there frozen, waiting for something, anything. That's when the floor creaked, and from the shadows of the far corner, something stepped forward. It wasn't the creature from the woods, it was Claire, or at least it looked like her. But there was something wrong. Her eyes, they were blank, lifeless. She smiled, a twisted, unnatural grin, and in a voice that wasn't hers, she whispered, "You shouldn't have come." Jake bolted for the door and I followed, sprinting into the night. We ran, not caring where we were going, just needing to get away. When we finally stopped, gasping for air, we realized something terrifying. The forest was quiet again. No growls, no whispers, just the wind in the trees. But Claire was gone. So was Sam and Lily. We searched for hours, calling their names, but there was no sign of them. It wasn't until dawn broke that we found their tents, empty, torn open from the inside. I never went back to that forest. I don't know what happened to the others, or if they ever made it out. But sometimes, late at night, I hear whispers outside my window, and I can't help but wonder, did they ever really leave? Or are they still out there waiting for the next group of campers to stumble into the whispering pines?